I used to not be a Metroid fan. I just never really saw myself drawn to it at a young age. I had known about Samus and Ridley through Super Smash Bros, but aside from some masterpieces in Brawl for Super Metroid, I had yet to properly experience the franchise. This was the beginning of a script for a cancelled Metroid Prime retrospective, dated all the way back to December 2019. After Nintendo had released a video covering Prime 4's delay, I decided that I wanted to review the previous entries in the series in order to have all of them under my belt before Prime 4 releases. So why did I abandon the project? Because making videos is hard. Looking back at my channel in late 2019, all I had really covered by this point was mediocre licensed games, and my upload schedule was infrequent, if I'm being generous. So nothing has changed, right? So needless to say, covering one of the most famous GameCube games of all time was a little bit intimidating. Also, and this is a true story, out of curiosity I decided to look up another Prime 1 retrospective just to see how they structured their intro, only to find out that my intro lines were almost word for word identical to this ever video.
I am not a Metroid fan. At least, I didn't used to be.
I got so salty about my own unoriginality that I decided to end the video right there. That brings us to now. You may have heard of a certain remaster being released. What? Unsurprisingly, this made me want to revisit this video topic, and more importantly, see if Metroid Prime 1 really held up to the reputation it's earned over the years. Because if you hear anyone bring up a Metro game in general as a franchise, it's usually because people are going absolutely nuts over how good it is. I said usually. There is a reason why Metroid-related reaction videos garner so much attention. It's because it's a showcase of pure passion. People will literally go feral just because the name Metroid is brought up, even in passing. At the top of that Metroid hype pyramid sits the Prime series, by far the most popular subset of games, at least if we're going off the reviews at the time, with several 10 out of 10 scores. Not to mention equally as many scores in the 90s. So naturally I jumped off my seat, opened up the nearest Word document, and began work on a Metroid Prime 2 video. Or at least that was the plan at first, but then I realized you can't really talk about Prime 2 without covering the first game. So I will quickly make a video explaining why I like Metroid Prime 1. What? So anyway, let's take a copy of Metroid Prime Remastered, and since I'm going to be talking about the GameCube original today, it's the version I'm the most familiar with, and I don't like the ported controls from Trilogy. I'm analyzing this version of the game because I want to compare it to the standards of when it first came out, and if I end up doing a video on Prime 2 or 3, I want to make sure the comparison is as fair as possible. Is that alright with you all? Well, it better be, because it's my video, you're just watching it. Let's start by laying down some context to how Prime even came to be. I personally believe that much of this information is fairly well known already, so for the sake of brevity I'm not going to spend too long on this. But after the release of Super Metroid in 1994, Nintendo weren't sure what to do with the franchise with the upcoming release of the N64. The only Metroid representation on the console at all was Samus' inclusion in Super Smash Bros, which was just a retread of her design from Super Metroid, which, to be fair, how would you design a Metroid game that works on this thing? It doesn't help that games at the time that weren't 3D were cast into the shadow realm by review outlets. This is when Retro Studios came in, who were working on a strange new ambitious direction for Metroid on consoles. Instead of the typical 2D platforming based games the series is known for, like Metroid Fusion, which was being developed for the Game Boy Advance at around the same time, Retro was developing a first person shooter, which honestly makes a lot of sense. This was the 2000s after all. Gaming was moving in a much more mature direction, mainly stemming from the increased graphical prowess of the upcoming generation of consoles, alongside the popularity of games like Mortal Kombat, Resident Evil, and Half-Life, which targeted older players while pushing the boundaries of what was ethically allowed in video games, leading to a broader appeal for gaming as a whole. Now I'm sure you could argue that those particular Atari games could count as targeting an older audience, but I'm talking about it in more of a mainstream sense. Nintendo had tried to market towards their aging player base in the 90s, but when your game output consists of Yoshi's Island, Kirby's Dream Land, and Donkey Kong Country, it's going to be a pretty hard sell to come across as a system for manly men and hardcore gamers. So as a result, they overcompensated beyond belief. Guys, look at our edgy mascot, Kirby. You weren't fooling anyone, guys. They needed a franchise that actually fit their bizarre advertising campaigns, since there are only so many SWAT Team Mario Tennis commercials you can make before it comes across as desperate. Out of every Nintendo-owned franchise, Metroid did seem like the biggest prime candidate for a modern update. But there was trouble in paradise, since Retro Studios was developing several projects at this point in time, most notably Raven Blade. And to keep the segment brief, let's just say that things weren't exactly going well with any of these. So eventually, all of them except for the Metroid project were cancelled, to make sure the game was in prime enough condition for release in 2002.
Oh my God, stop with the plot!
That doesn't mean the development process was smooth at all going forward. Turns out taking a Super Nintendo side-scroller and converting it into a 3D action game is very hard. In fact, according to a Kiwi Talks interview in 2021 with the director of Metroid Prime, the game went through an extreme crunch during the last 9 months of its development, and left the team in absolute shambles and on the brink of collapse until Nintendo stepped in and bought them. Which is definitely rough to hear. They clearly put in their all into making sure this game lives up to the hype. So let's see if they succeeded. Text appears on screen talking about a distress beacon that's located at a derelict space station. Then we get introduced to the main character of the game, Metroid.
It's just a joke. That was a close one.
This is when the game gives you a quick tutorial about the controls before you enter the space station. I'll cover those in a minute, but for now let's bring up a new mechanic, the scan visor, which you can use to activate control panels and also gather information about the objects around you. It's very intuitive and makes sense since the player is figuring out new information at the same time Samus does. This becomes important as you begin to trek through the space station. It's clear that something is amiss. You see wiring out of place, debris floating, then you enter the third room and...
What happened here?
This is a Nintendo game with multiple corpses strewn across the floor from the first 10 minutes. Insane. As you travel deeper into the space station, you'll find more space pirates who are alive, but in critical condition. If you decide to scan them, you'll see broken legs, internal bleeding. It's pretty damn morbid. But you continue forward until you reach the main room of the space station, which houses the Parasite Queen, the first major boss of the game. You probably know it as that stage from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, you fake fan! Anyway, after her defeat, the space station begins its self-destruction protocol, and a 7-minute timer starts to count down as the game yells at you to
evacuate.
You now frantically make your way out of the building as it starts to crumble around you. At least until Ridley decides to photobomb your escape route, that rapscallion. You continue rolling throughout the air ducts and squeezing through thin corridors until you reach an elevator. And after scanning the control panel, the hallway explodes around you, flinging Samus into a nearby wall, causing all of the mechanisms of your suit to malfunction and fall off. All you can do in this moment is sit there and read the indicator in your suit that tells you each and every ability you just lost, allowing the weight of the situation to fully sink in. You then just barely make it to your ship in time as you see Ridley fly towards Talon 4. After landing on Talon 4, you are then let loose as a player and are allowed to explore the world around you, with only your ability to move and shoot left. You need to figure out how to regain your lost suit functions quickly if you want any chance to survive. This introduction segment is about as Metroid as it comes, and it's incredible. They teach the player all of your basic mechanics and let you get a feel for how all of them function, and tease a few of the later ones for good measure, just to rip them all away from you last minute. All the while setting the tone for the game moving forward, all within less than 20 minutes. You learn that the space pirates are up to something nefarious, you need to regain your lost abilities, and Ridley is the prime target. One interesting aspect of this intro sequence and Prime 1 as a whole is how many structural parallels it shares with Super Metroid. That game also begins by entering a ruined space station, being confronted with Ridley, then you barely escape before it explodes. You then land on a rainy, rocky section of the surface. This game gets a lot of its DNA from Super Metroid, which I think is fine since they're trying to essentially reinvent the wheel here, so I think it's fine that they work around that framework since the gameplay is different enough to still be unique in its own right. Plus, Super Metroid is not a bad base to go off of. It has a really good progression system and a nice variety of world themes. Mario 64 gets a lot of its DNA from the older games and a stack of stock photo CDs, so I think this decision is for the best when it comes to establishing this new gameplay style, just to make sure that's still held on to the Metroid fundamentals. So just keep in mind that we'll be touching on how Prime utilizes past elements more as we move forward. Now that we've landed on Talon 4, this is a good opportunity to get a taste for a game's controls. And controls they certainly are. I'm not entirely sure how to properly describe these, but have you ever heard of GoldenEye?
Check, please.
Yeah, these controls are fairly unorthodox if all you're used to is modern shooters. The left stick allows you to move forward and back, but instead of strafing left to right, you turn instead. But if you hold down the L button, it'll lock the camera in place and you can move around freely. It also doubles as a lock-on button to better aim at enemies. The R button allows you to freely aim your arm cannon with the left stick, but at the cost of being on the move.
Okay, Nintendo, I know you're new to this FPS thing and all, but if you look right here, there's a really subtle detail on the right stick. It has a C imprinted in it. For camera.
Yeah, this game uses a fairly antiquated control scheme. The best way to describe it is that the left stick operates on tank controls, while the triggers allow for more precise aiming controls. If that sounds like it would be incredibly awkward, then yeah, it definitely can be. The platforming is the most effective by far. General movement control's fine enough, since you can easily use the diagonals to turn, but when it comes to the actual platforming, it can feel a bit odd. You need to take most jumps semi-carefully. You can turn slightly in the air, which is useful for course correcting if you happen to jump at an off angle, but if the required turn between platforms is greater than 90 degrees, then you're forced to stop and turn before jumping again, which is something that can be pretty tedious. I personally think that the platforming feels fine enough most of the time, and it's something that you can fairly quickly get used to. But in a game with as much platforming as Metroid, it can definitely be seen as very inconvenient. To be completely fair to Retro Studios, dual stick controls weren't entirely the standard by this time, although 2002 is cutting it pretty close, so I do think that's a safe guess that the team had taken influence from GoldenEye 64, since it was the flagship shooter on the N64. The main tell for this being that the intro to the game has a suspiciously similar camera movement to first person that GoldenEye has during the start of its levels. Also, if we're being completely honest, Metroid isn't necessarily known for having the best platforming controls, more so with the earlier games. Super Metroid has more than enough jank in its movement. I would be lying if I said that I didn't get frustrated trying to clear small gaps and climbing up the longer rooms, and that didn't change the fact that the game is still considered to be a masterpiece to most people, especially if your name is Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So the controls in Prime being particularly unpolished is a blemish on the game, no doubt, but I think it's forgivable considering when this was released. It's at least something you can live with.
Also, since this is a sci-fi first-person shooter released in 2002, naturally there be comparisons to Halo. For example, it is 2002 Metacritic review from Nicholas B that states, "No, I cannot say goodbye Halo, you stupid moron. Where is the multiplayer biz notch? Where is the Game of the Year award? The game is incredible, but nothing compared to the classics like Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, or Halo." But really, the only problem with this game is that the controls are weird, but since the GameCube controller is not designed for FPS, I congratulate Nintendo on the effort. Great game. The 0 is just to get the attention of the idiot who said it was better than Halo. 0 out of 32 users found this helpful. Poetic.
But with this being a Metroid game, you can do more than just simply jump and shoot, but once you find the ability at least, you can also turn to a morph ball in order to roll into narrow pathways. Much like that every video game character can turn to a ball. What is her name again? It starts with an S? Oh wait, yeah, SpongeBob. As far as the controls go, I don't know, it's a ball you can roll. What else do you want me to say? Well, you can use the morph ball bomb in order to hop up ledges, which is neat, but that's kind of it, barring unlockable upgrades. Aside from its use in puzzles, I personally use it as much as possible since it is faster than normal movement. And if the animation phasing the morph ball can take a while, and I mean it's a mechanic where you can roll around a ball in a 3D space. I'm kinda predisposed to enjoy this. As awkward as the control scheme is, I do think it was at least partially on purpose, since this game's main focus isn't on the platforming and exploration like you're probably used to with a Metroid game. Rather, the majority of the focus is on combat. The lock-on mechanic might come across like a crutch for the controls being awkward, and that's because it is, but they structured it differently than your average shooter. In a game like Call of Duty or Halo, the main challenge with combat is being able to precisely aim your weapons at the enemy, while maybe taking some comfort behind an object to let your health regenerate. There are different weapon types that are more effective at certain ranges, but at its core, all that really matters is that you can aim your reticle well enough to kill the enemy before they can kill you. The caveat to this is that aiming with a joystick feels like garbage, and is extremely imprecise. Now I'm sure some of you are going to disagree with me, and that's fair I suppose, but there is a reason why a wide majority of console shooters employ a very extreme auto aim in order to compensate for how imprecise this form of aiming really is. The lock-on system in Metroid Prime really just serves to cut out the middleman, and to change the focus away from pure precision. With the way that enemies typically behave in Metroid games, expecting a player to be able to keep up with the aggressive and varied attack patterns during combat might have been a massive headache with traditional joystick aiming. I think that the lock-on is a nice compromise in this sense. That being said, it doesn't mean that every single shot will land no matter what. Enemies who move around frequently or are airborne can still dodge your shots fairly easily, so you still need to pay attention and time out your attacks in order to ensure that they land on the enemy. Combat in this game still requires a fair amount of patience until you can figure out the best possible way to get past a certain enemy's defenses. With the lock-on feature moving the focus from combat away from pure precision, it does mean that this game has to come up with another way to keep the combat invigorated, and that solution is formed in a variety of ways. The first of which being the scan visor, a mechanic that allows you to analyze your surroundings. Well, the game takes this into account when it comes to enemies. Upon scanning whatever foe you're up against, which is sometimes easier said than done, the game will give you a very detailed description of what the enemy is and what it's weak to, alongside some images of it. Once you scan an enemy type, the log of it will be saved and can be accessed in the logbook for future reference. Considering how important strategizing is to the combat of this game, being able to scan enemies and find weaknesses to exploit is extremely useful, and not to mention definitely in character that Samus would assess situations like this. And as a player, it helps to teach you the inner workings to the combat system. It's a pretty damn useful tool for your survival, and in my opinion it is an absolutely imperative addition to the game. And since the lock-on forces you to face your enemy at all times, if you hit the jump button while strafing to either side, you will instead do a fast sidestep out of the way. It's the main method that the game gives you for dodging weapon fire. It makes peeking out from behind cover much snappier. It also means that the game introduced a lot of enemies that charge directly at you, which is certainly effective at getting you to learn how to utilize it. It has a good amount of fluidity to it, and if used correctly can give you an impressive amount of mobility in battle. But it can also be fairly awkward at the worst of times, since I've had more than one occasion where I need to jump and end up dodging instead. I've fallen off of ledges more times than I can count, but I don't really think this is the developer's fault as much as me needing to pay more attention while in active combat, you goober. When the alternative is awkwardly flailing away with gross GoldenEye controls, I'll take a slightly odd learning curve over having less movement options during combat. I personally always saw the addition of the dodge as the developers trying to add elements of circle strafing from the shooters of old into Prime. I don't really know if that was the intention, but if so, I commend them on the effort. Even then, that isn't the only way they spiced up the combat experience. Much like the previous games in the series, the more you progress through the game, the more upgrades you get to Samus's arm cannon, through the forms of the different beams you acquire, which all come from previous games in the series. Each of these would increase the power of your beam, or in the case of the ice beam, would freeze enemies and allow you to progress in the game. Prime 1 takes a slightly different approach to the beam system, however. Instead of replacing or upgrading the current beam you hold, you acquire the beam as a secondary firing option, allowing you to switch between these different elemental attacks during combat, with different types of enemies having weaknesses to certain beams. The combat in the game isn't really about the raw power of your arsenal as much as it is about strategizing what type of effectiveness works against what you're fighting. Yes, I'm comparing Metroid to Pokemon, I know, but it does apply here to some degree. First of all, you have the Power Beam. It's your mundane, run-of-the-mill standard weapon. It has a fairly low damage output when compared to the other three, but also has the fastest firing rate, so it's still very useful against bosses and fast-moving enemies, since you are much more likely to get hits in with this beam when compared to the others. Next, you have the Wave Beam, which is obtained fairly early on in the game. This one is used mainly as a means to stun enemies around you, and it's the only beam that can defeat these atom-looking things. It's particularly effective against the early space-powered grunt enemies, since stunning them with a charge shot, then firing a missile will make quick work of them. That being said, out of all of the beams, it's honestly the least effective in most combat scenarios. I tend to avoid using it unless it's absolutely required. The Ice Beam might not seem that useful off the bat since the fire rate is extremely slow, but that's because it is an absolutely brutal force to be reckoned with. All it takes is a charge shot and a missile, and any foe will be shattered both physically and emotionally. The Ice Beam is easily the best beam in a combat scenario, almost too good to the point of being completely broken. Really, the only downside I can think of is that it isn't effective against ice enemies, which duh, and it can be pretty hard to hit flying enemies. Although with enough effort, it'll still do the job. No matter what enemy I came across, I still found myself changing to the Ice Beam time after time. I'm not afraid to give enemies the cold shoulder. Lastly, there is the Plasma Beam, which you get very late in the playthrough. Now before you go yell at me, oh my god, he's spoiling it, the game does show you this beam during one of the demo movies on the title screen, so it's fair game. This beam fires quick, laser-like beams of fire, and is supposed to be the most combat-oriented one of them all. Most of your early game enemies get killed with 1 or 2 shots, and it does pretty gnarly damage against bosses. It's so powerful it can literally disintegrate certain enemies upon impact. But as good as this beam is, aside from needing it to progress through the red doors in the late game, I feel like it's really not as useful as it seems. The Ice Beam already decimates most enemies fairly easily, so the novelty of feeling like you become extremely powerful doesn't quite fully land in my opinion. I do still like this beam type, but it does feel like you get it a little late in the playthrough for me to feel like it justifies its own value. Another main aspect of the beams is that they can all be charged up by holding down the fire button and releasing, which does more damage at the cost of the time it takes to activate. The charge shot will also draw in health items and missiles from defeating enemies, which is a really well thought out compromise to make collecting these less tedious while in a 3D space. It would be so irritating if you're in the middle of a firefight and had to awkwardly run away just to grab a stupid health orb. So if you find yourself in a pinch, you can easily just charge your beam to get some health back as you leave for an opening. Either way, having several different elemental weapon types at your disposal, with the C-stick allowing you to switch between any of them on the fly, makes combat feel much more versatile and encourages the player to strategize as opposed to just spamming the power beam over and over. It's the closest equivalent this game has to weapon classes, I suppose. In my opinion, this system helps set Metroid Prime apart and helps justify the switch to the first-person perspective. Also, on your arsenal, you have missiles. These are limited in number, unlike the infinite ammo of your beam weapons, but in return, they fire quickly and pack a massive punch. They also home in on enemies, making them particularly useful against the infrequent and annoying flying enemies in the game. They're pretty much just an all-reliable sort of weapon when you want to cause the enemy a lot of damage, but either don't want to deal with the hassle of charging up the beam weapons, or the enemy has a very small window for attack. Regardless, you're going to find yourself using missiles very often once you reach the tougher enemies the game has to offer. But as good as the missiles are on their own, their true potential is brought up once you gain access to the Super Missile. It's yet another returning item from Super Metroid that you acquire a little bit later in your playthrough. After you charge your power beam, all you have to do is press the missile button in order to unleash a Super Missile. It absolutely demolishes mounted turrets, space pirates, and essentially any enemy that dares cross your path. But at the cost of 5 missiles and the fairly lengthy amount of time time it takes to charge your power beam. I use the super missile all the goddamn time. For most of your playthrough, it's the ace up your sleeve, as long as you have enough missiles, which just happens to be the perfect motivation to seek out as many missile expansions that are scattered on the map, something I will cover later. As for now though, I can say that the game nailed the first person combat you'd expect from a game starring a badass bounty hunter like Samus. Once you master the combat system, you feel powerful, swiftly leaping between bullets to send some poor space pirate to the ragdoll doom. If we're talking about first person shooter combat built around using a controller from the get-go, you could argue this game almost got down to perfection, and I could not be happier with the result. And speaking of that, I know I'm far from the first person to talk about how good the graphics are. What a segue! But seriously, for a GameCube game in 2002, it is seriously some impressive stuff. Each room has an impressive amount of geometric detail to it. You can see the wires running along the walls and the hallways of the space frigate. The ruins have complex tilted walls and platforms, and much like every GameCube game, the water looks really good. It even has 3D ripples when you shoot at it. 3D! Not to mention the new Samus design for this game. It looks damn good for a GameCube game. You can almost put that model in a Wii U game and get away with it. As far as pure graphical detail goes, I can't think of any other game at the time that matches it. The other Nintendo games at the time look good and arguably hold up better, but still seem like they haven't fully figured out the hardware capabilities yet. The game that I think matches it the best might be Resident Evil 4, which also has GameCube water syndrome, but even then, I would argue that this game has aged much worse graphically. Hey, what about Halo 1? Sure. Now, I will be fair to those other games and point out how Metroid Prime does separate each room with doors, so each room is loaded one at a time. This allows for the game to have open-ended design while keeping up the graphical fidelity. It works almost seamlessly for the most part, although occasionally a door will take a bit to load, so you just have to sit there awkwardly. So some people might consider it cheating, but the separate rooms have always been a Metroid staple, so honestly it's just ingenious design on their part. One thing that absolutely complements the gameplay is the ridiculous attention to detail for a game of its time, most of which complement the first-person perspective. Some of these are fairly obvious to the player, like how the different beam weapons are all characterized by a different hand position and a color on the bottom right, and once equipped they modify the look of the arm can, with the wave beam making it extend horizontally and the ice beam making it extend vertically, which I personally think is a cute touch. Another one you've most likely noticed is how your visor will get signal interference when near the pulse bamboo. That's a goofy name. The guts of the enemies will stick to your visor when destroyed, and you even see Samus's reflection in the visor when there's a bright flash. The hug will even slightly lag behind your camera movements when turning, all somewhat subtle touches that you may not have been super aware of while playing, but does add to the sense of immersion while exploring the area. This also extends to the environments themselves, like how you can shoot birds out of the sky and how the lights from the beam weapons will make the surrounding walls glow. I think the landing room of Town Ford does an incredible job showcasing how immersive the game really is, with the raindrops bouncing off your arm cannon, and if you look up, raindrops will begin falling on your visor. These kind of touches are still really impressive to me despite this game being over 20 years old. The attention to detail also extends to the game's soundtrack. Metroid Prime's soundtrack is absolutely sublime, and although I'm not the most professional music critic out there, I'll try my best to explain. The best way to go over this is to explain why I love the soundtracks of previous games in the series. Like with the first Metroid game, the game's concept and opening theme might give the player the idea that there will be a very cold and unnerving journey throughout the planet you're exploring. You then boot up the game and get met with this Legend of Zelda-esque fun music. Then as you slowly get lower and lower into the map, the music starts to become much more atmospheric and brooding. By the time you reach Mother Brain, no, it doesn't spoil it, don't look to them! The music doesn't even have much of a melody anymore, just resembling utter chaos. This approach helps to emphasize a sense of loneliness and increase the tension you would feel while getting further and further into this isolated world. The game has several famous songs that you could recognize even if you hadn't played much or any of the game at all. Then when it came to Super Metroid, they combined both of the major strengths of the original game's soundtrack. Since now the game retains the atmospheric sound from the latter half of the original soundtrack, but it makes sure to retain the strong melodies from the original as well. What you get is a soundtrack that is equally as iconic as the original game, and is debatably even more Metroid sounding as a result. Then we get the Prime, which definitely took notes from Super Metroid, much like everything else. The atmospheric jams of that game have been retained, but this time they had a lot more freedom due to having CD quality audio at their disposal. A lot of tracks sound much more orchestral, with much more natural percussion and what sounds like a choir singing in the background of many of these songs. It arguably sounds a lot more like the natural ambience of the area surrounding you than just the compressed samples of the SNES game. But it wouldn't be a Metroid soundtrack without some groovy iconic tracks, and Prime delivers that in some. The real standout aspect of the soundtrack is the synth work. Pretty much every song features it prominently, and it's absolutely sublime. The main lead synth used in most of the tracks I can only describe as cool and icy, and it almost sounds like the sound of the rushing wind around the player. They then layer in other sounds into the mix that sound almost like walls being hit, creatures walking around, and other atmospheric elements that really add to the mystery and uncertainty of the world around you. Each world of the game has its own unique and little elements to their soundtracks that help sell the environmental theming to the player. Chozo Ruins has a shaker in the mix alongside what sounds like a growl, I think? Magmore Caverns is a very heavy Dynabird theme and air ride-esque drums, alongside some kind of wooden sounding instrument. Then you have Phendrana? How do you pronounce this? Then you have Phallic Drifts, which has strong winds and what sounds like little water droplets. Anyway, this is getting a little long-winded, but I think you get the point. Before I move on though, I will point out how the soundtracks change depending on how deep you get into a given world. It's actually the opposite of how it functioned in the original Metroid on the NES. It actually starts out very atmospheric with almost no melody when you're in the elevator room about to enter the world. Then the main melodies start coming in once you start exploring the world itself. Then once you get really deep into a world, it gets even less atmospheric and just becomes an absolute jam and a half. Take Phendrana Drifts as an example. That's way more groovy than any Metroid song has any right to become. In fact, this game has a lot of situational music, at least a lot more than I noticed during my casual playthrough. Each one has a song specifically when you have to do a lengthy puzzle segment, which I didn't even notice once when I was playing, to be honest, but it serves as a subtle touch to let the player know that, hey, there's a puzzle in this room to do, which makes a lot of sense for anyone that gets lost, although the fact that I never noticed it might not be the best praise for it. Either way, the music in Prime has clearly made its mark in the franchise and in the hearts of its fans, with the theme for Magmore Caverns even being slightly remixed in Samus Returns for the 3DS. You can be assured that the chill grooves and Tararico twang of these tunes live on rent-free in my subconscious forever.
My mother's very proud.
Alright, we talked about all these Prime features now, the graphics, the music, the combat, the beam powers. That's all great and all, but this is a Metroid game. You know what's at the core of every Metroid game? The exploration. And the best way to talk about this is to rewind a little bit back to Chozo Ruins. You can only move and shoot, and you need to retrieve those lost items. So where do you begin? Well, we have a handful of available paths to go down. The one right in front of us has a barrier keeping us from entering. The above path leads to a dead end since there are trees growing through the pathway, and there is a seemingly inaccessible door up above with an energy tank, just so you know as the player to look out later for a potential route to reach it. So this leaves you with only one possible route to actually proceed with, which is a series of rooms full of enemies, most notably war wasps, which infinitely respawn and charge after you, especially when the door takes forever to load. Eventually it brings you to this tilted room with the missile expansion sitting right in the open, just begging you to come and take it. Don't mind if I don't pick it up, since it's actually just bait for a boss fight. Typical. Once you grab it and blast into the next door, you'll be met with an energy tank and a dead end, which is fine since it was that inaccessible door from earlier. And on the way back, you get an opportunity to learn that the war wasp hives are actually weak to missile fire. And I noticed how the devs definitely put those there on purpose. Nice touch. The blast door ends up leading to a room with the morph ball on prominent display. Wow, I can't possibly imagine what's gonna happen when I land here. Alright, let's just fast forward past this. And this segment in general, I think you get the point by now. The progression in this game is mainly tied around the collection of power-ups. Now, as you might know, there exists this little genre of game called the Metroidvania. The idea is that you're placed in a pseudo open-ended map and are free to explore the map around you, but the progression is gated off with upgrades and collectibles, so you need to hunt them down in order to continue, all the while becoming more powerful and mobile in the process. It was primarily popularized by the Metroid and Castlevania franchises, hence the name. Although Prime 1 has this design philosophy throughout, I do think that Chozo Ruins demonstrates peak Metroidvania progression. The game already introduced you to all these basic abilities back in the Space Frigate, but now you need to collect each individually. The game uses the opportunity to have the player learn and understand how each of these abilities ties into the problem solving in Prime. See a small pathway with stones blocking it? Well, travel a few rooms forward and wow, look, a mini boss to get the morph ball bomb. Want to get the charge beam back, but there's a gate with several Chozo symbols on it? Oh look, there are conveniently the exact same symbols hidden around the room that you need to scan in order to unlock it. Wow, I should remember that for later. You may not realize it while playing, but Chozo Ruins was actually teaching you how to beat the game itself without you noticing, which in my opinion is incredible game design. Even outside of the Chozo Ruins, there are really subtle examples that you may never pick up on while playing. For example, early on in Tower and Overworld, as you continue forward a few rooms and start blasting the zoomers crawling around, it's not what it sounds like, it's just what the enemy is called.
I should cut this out of the script.
You tried defeating this red looking one blocking off this ledge, but it doesn't work. That's because the hallway that the ledge leads to requires missiles to pass, which just happens to be the weapon that defeats the enemy on the ledge. A neat little subtle addition from the developers. I thought it was cool. On a related note, in the classic Metroid formula, they block your progression in a variety of ways. The first being the different colored doors that require a different weapon type. There exist 4 of these in Super Metroid, but only 2 are used in Prime, being the blue doors that can reopen with any weapon, and a missile door, which has been replaced with a blast gate that you need to shoot off with a missile instead. I imagine they changed this in order to not have to use missiles every single time you unlock certain doors, while still having the missile doors in order to gate off certain sections in the early game. Since combat is a much greater focus, they most likely assumed that having to waste valuable missiles tiles, domed up doors will be seen as annoying, which I think is a pretty reasonable compromise. As is the compromise for the removal of the green and yellow doors in Super Metroid. They added colored doors for the beam weapons you earn throughout the game. This change makes sense since collecting the new beam powers is the major progression system of the game, so it helps gate off later areas of the game, while also letting the player know when they're close to getting a new beam since you start seeing the colored doors pop up. This helps build anticipation for collecting a new weapon, and it makes collecting a new power feel much more rewarding as a result, since much more of the map opens up immediately, and it encourages you to travel backwards in order to enter previously locked off rooms. I love this change personally. It honestly makes more sense than the previous door system since it relied on using power bombs and super missiles, and I'm pretty convinced it helped lead to a greater variety of doors in games like Dread. There also exists another type of entrance in Super Metroid, the shutters, which are a gate that can only be opened for one side, which aren't specifically used in Prime as far as I could tell, but there are a few doors in the game that can only be opened from one side. Although this only applies to doors you aren't meant to enter anyway to prevent sequence breaking. Although I made it to this door fair and square, game, you can't just lock me out. Man, let me out! There is this one gate later in the game that can only be opened from one side, but considering the fact that it's only one, I think comparing it to the shutters in Super Metroid is a massive stretch. Let's move on to the bread and butter, meat and potatoes of Metroid, hidden blocks. A feature that is standard to 2D entries in the series, where certain parts of rooms are breakable, revealing hidden paths that either lead to secret items like missile expansions or advance your progress in the game. Or it opens up a small path they need to progress through using the morph ball. Usually there is some kind of visual hint that lets the player know to shoot at a certain spot, or it's located at some corner of the room so the player would naturally guess that there is some sort of hidden path there. Also, if you don't have the item that's required, it will simply show an image representing the missing item, so you'll know to return later. But a wide majority of the time, it's up to the player to figure out when and where they need to hunt these items down in order to progress. Most games do a pretty good job at remaining fair and making the required path obvious enough to where the player isn't literally shooting randomly, but Super Metroid in particular is extremely unforgiving in this regard. You can figure out where to go on your own, but it requires significantly more trial and error than many of the other games in the series. It was a game made to sell a player's guide. There are two main ways to view a system like this. You either think that's a core aspect of Metroid's design that promotes experimentation and makes figuring out the puzzle that is Metroid more rewarding. Or you think that hidden blocks are a time waster at best that bogs down the experience and makes the game inaccessible to new players. Well, with Prime being 3D, they took a bit of a different approach to this. Since this game was targeted to a more hardcore gamer audience who wouldn't care as much about the puzzle mechanics as they would the ability to shoot space pirates in the face, they chose to dial back the puzzle solving aspect just a tad. Like most of the puzzles in this game consist of scanning this control panel or using this morph ball to activate the switch. Not exactly the biggest head scratchers. So I'm going to focus on the more exploration based puzzle solving, or the lack thereof. Don't get me wrong, you still need to hunt down the maps for power-ups in order to proceed like your classic Metroidvania, but the game doesn't really have that many examples of needing to find fully hidden pathways in order to proceed like in Super Metroid, besides one example in the late game that I won't spoil for now. Most of the traditional hidden pathways that you would expect are reserved for the morph ball, only requiring the player to jump using the morph ball bombs or roll through some grate or hole in order to reach another room. It's the most Metroid-y type of secrets that are available to you. Another good example is the boost ball power-up you unlock for the morph ball, which on its own doesn't seem super useful. It just allows you to gain a speed boost while on the morph ball, but the developers use it in order to add these boost ball half pipes, which might look slightly off when casually exploring, and once you have the boost ball, it clicks that you need to use it to scale up these half pipes in order to access higher areas. It's semi-infrequent in the game, but I won't lie, this was always my favorite form of traversal. This is mainly because of the obvious. I mean, can you blame me? I find physics puzzles neat. Moving on, there are some quote-unquote hidden pathways like the power bomb rocks later on in the game, but they're literally in the middle of hallways. So if you simply peek at the minimap, you can see that there is clearly a door on the other end, so it's not exactly hidden. Some of the power-ups also had to have their use scaled down in order to end up completely breaking the game. The main example being the spider ball, which previously was used to crawl along any wall of the game, now being limited to specific metal paths designated for their use. That doesn't mean that the hidden walls and paths don't exist, far from it, but now they're used almost exclusively to serve as a means to hide hidden collectibles. The most plentiful of these being the missile expansions, which increase the number of missiles you can carry by 5. There exist 49 of these in the game, and although a decent chunk of these are fairly easy to find, the majority are really well hidden. See a random morph ball hole that looks out of place, or see a path that you clearly can't get to until you return with another power up. These are most likely hiding a missile expansion, or possibly an energy tank, which gives you a whole other health bar. These are obviously extremely useful to your playthrough, and as a result, half of these are fairly straightforward to acquire since the developers didn't want to completely leave the players in the dark while playing. Either that or I'm just good at finding these, since in my remastered playthrough I found them all, and in the GameCube playthrough I did for this review, I only missed one. But on the other hand, I missed a lot of the missile expansions. Pretty much every power-up in this game is used to some extent while hiding these. Honestly, I think hunting for the missile expansions gives more value to some of the power-ups than the game does normally. Like the grapple beam, which normally I would save the discussion of until later, but the game spoils it existing during the intro, so I'll just cover it now. It gets used in late game, and honestly, it's the least fun upgrade you get. It gets tied to this flying magnetic enemy that moves around constantly, so you need to time out when to activate the grapple beam in order to get a suitable angle for crossing gaps. Its use can get pretty tedious since this is how it's mostly used aside from grabbing onto a few hooks in order to reach the missile expansions, and that use isn't really that fun anyway.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that the grapple beam turns this game into Metroid Prime. Alright, I'll see myself out.
Either way, let me get back on topic and talk about the most interesting change to puzzle solving in the Prime series, which is the use of the scan visor. I already brought up how you can find more information about your environment with it, and its use for activating switches, but it also works as a method of figuring out the many environmental puzzles around you. When you open the scan visor, you'll see two different colored symbols based on what object you're looking at. There is the orange one, which represents general objects in the world, or represents an enemy, and it only exists just to give you a little tidbit about what you're looking at. Then there's the red one, which basically stands for
This is very important, please scan.
These can be a variety of things. Obviously the main use for this are the control panels that you need to scan. But as far as its use in exploration, remember those hidden walls I brought up and how they seem like they might be kind of BS since you as the player might not have a great sense as to what objects you can destroy. Not to mention what weapon you would use to destroy them. Like this emblem for example. It really doesn't look that different from the other similar looking structures you can find on the walls in this game. You would probably think nothing of it and move past it in a normal playthrough. But if you feel inclined to take out the scan visor and scan the red symbol, it means that the object is destructible, and it'll give you a description of the material that the object is made of. These all correspond with different weapons you acquired during your playthrough. There are a few important ones you need to remember. Cordite means super missile, Bandesium means power bomb, Talic alloy means morph ball bomb, and according to Metroid Recon, which is the resource I use to find these, there is 3 separate materials for missiles: sandstone, radion, and brimstone. I cannot tell you how important it is that you can scan objects to figure out what weapon to use against them. In 2D Metroid, having random blocks that are breakable by certain power-ups can definitely be seen as aggravating, but you can at least make an argument that it's a fair system. For one, the game is blocky by nature, so there aren't too many complex structures in the world, and when there are, they typically aren't destructible. So when you're looking for secret areas, you usually have some idea where to look for the most part. When you need to shoot through the floor in certain rooms, it's when you reach some kind of dead end in your progression, and there is some kind of clue in the area. But in scenarios that there aren't, there are only so many rooms and so many blocks you could possibly shoot, so you can usually brute force your way forward no matter what.
But take that concept and apply it to a 3D room? There's no tiles to shoot, so the sky is quite literally the limit of what can be destructible or not.
I imagine players trying to find all the missile expansions would end up wasting key items several times on random objects when they really don't have to. Even if I think they did a good job distinguishing objects that are destructible for the most part, some of the more tricky puzzles to figure out would be borderline impossible without some kind of hint, which is why I think that the scan visor is very much a required mechanic. I think that it says a lot when even Super Metroid, the second most cryptic of the Metroid games, has the X-ray scope as an unlockable power-up later on in the game in order to provide a method for searching for hidden blocks. Because core game mechanics being cryptic can be very annoying if they aren't handled correctly, so having an option that makes understanding how the gameplay loop functions is generally a good idea. I personally think that the implementation of the scan visor in the Prime games is the logical evolution of their X-ray scope from Super Metroid, since they both serve a similar purpose. They act as a cleverly disguised tutorial of sorts. The game also rewards the player greatly for scanning everything in their environment as well. I already mentioned how the game keeps track of the enemies you scan, but that's only the beginning of what it keeps track of. The game has multiple categories of scannable objects, which are creatures, research, lore, and space pirate data. Research refers to any item or object in the game that helps Samus with her journey. See a spider ball rail, grapple beam hook, or Samus's ship? Those scans go into the research tab. It also includes missiles, each individual health pickup type, literally anything that relates to a power-up you can unlock, or replenishes a weapon you hold should be scanned. The lore category refers to chosen logs that you can find scattered about the map. You can tell where one is because it's represented with what looks like rippling water on a patch of the wall. These contain the majority of the game's deeper plot, but mainly focus on the Chosen Ruins world in particular. As a bit of an aside, I won't go into too much detail when it comes to these in this review, since as interesting as the story is in this game, I never really cared about it too much personally. Plus, if I went out of my way to read all these logs and explain it, I think that wouldn't be super interesting to sit through as a viewer. I will cover a few story moments when I feel that's necessary, but just know that you won't be getting getting a deep dive on the inner workings of the plot for the most part. With that said, these are a major aspect of the game's storytelling, so you should definitely be seeking these out in your playthrough for more than just filling the logbook. Lastly, there is the pirate data, which I will touch on later in this video, since I do want to go into detail with this separately. The main award for going out of your way to scan and document the world around you is the art gallery. You unlock more and more of the gallery per each quarter of the logbook you fill up, and although it isn't necessarily much of a reward for your casual player, it is enough motivation to at least pull out the scan visor every now and then to learn about the world around you. And in that regard, I think the developers completely succeeded with how it was implemented. If you want to play Metroid Prime the way that developers intended, you should be scanning everything and anything around you. So having any kind of award for doing so opens up the gateway for players learning much more about the game itself, which is excellent game design. The scan visor is the gameplay loop of Metroid Prime to some extent. The game was completely designed around its use, or you would think, since much of the scannable material was actually added very late into the game's development, according to a Game Informer interview with Mark Pacini, the director of the game.
Nintendo's thing was like, this is going to be about the scan visor. This game is about scanning the environment. And we're like, okay, but this is like an action game. This is like a shooting game. But it's the brilliance of the and it was Tsunabe-san that basically was like, he had an idea of like, oh, well, what if we did this? And you can get information. This is how we do the tutorials, and this is how you give the players instruction. And we could do all these things with the scan visor. And because their motivation was, this is a game about the scan visor, and ours was not that at all. But we did the due diligence and integrated it in a way that felt natural to the game. And like, how would we want to do this? How would we do this? So that's how it went back and forth. And that was like a really great suggestion on their part, because it seems so simple now and it seems so rote now. But at the time, there weren't a lot of games like this.
I find this so insane. The literal core mechanic for figuring out the world around you could have just not existed. I can't really imagine a world where this mechanic wasn't present in the game. It's fundamental to understanding how to problem solve within this game's world. Without it, I honestly think this game might not be regarded as highly as it is now. I'm not even kidding when I say that. I think I'm just going to move on now because I can't afford to stay awake at 3 AM again thinking about that possibility.
Not again.
While we're talking about the exploration, I should probably cover the sheep-off in the room with this entire genre, backtracking.
Not the backtracking.
That's all you hear about with these games. Backtracking is so tedious. Backtracking is the worst part of the game. Backtracking made me sell my firstborn child. You never hear the end of it. Or at least I think it's that way. I personally never had too much of an issue with it. I just always hear about it being this huge point of contention with these games. Honestly, I think Metroid Prime handled this part of the game pretty well. Like, sure, do you have to retread the same ground several times over the course of the game? Yeah, obviously. But it doesn't mean that you're doing the exact same thing every time. Generally, when you're exploring a particular world in this game, you end up traveling down a particular path, avoiding all of the doors that you can't enter yet until you find a power-up of some kind. Then eventually you will find a dead end in your path that requires a different item entirely, forcing you to travel to a previous location to use whatever ability you gained in order to progress. The game might feel like this giant expansive world as you play it, but as far as progression goes, it's actually quite linear. So that's why Metroid Prime might not feel like a great example of open world gaming, studybreaks.com, because it is not in fact an example of open world gaming at all.
Trust me when I say there are so many bad Metroid takes on the internet. Like, for example, there was actually an article released about Prime 4 and how it wasn't open world apparently, and how that's a huge disappointment to fans. Who?
You're being subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, guided to your next objective through the design of the world itself. It just might not feel that way since it's up to you to figure out the clues and find an exploit of interest you need to explore. In my opinion, a system like this feels way more rewarding than a game just literally pointing out where to go with a minimal blip or something. But let's say you do end up getting lost. Well, Prime introduced probably the most beginner-friendly mechanic to the series, the hint system. Whenever the game notices that you aren't making progress in a certain area, a little pop-up will appear saying something like Predator Activity Analyzed. Predator increase in Phendrana region, which is the one used for the wave beam. Then by pressing the Z button to bring up the map, the game will show you the room where the next key item is located, giving the player an idea of where to go, but you still need to figure out how exactly to reach that room on your own. Now personally, I try not to use the hint system when I can, since I find it more fun to figure out the game's puzzles on my own, since I can usually skim through the map menu to find some odd room I hadn't entered yet, so you can get through the whole game just fine if you choose to ignore it. The game does allow you to turn it off in a menu if you wish, which I think is a fine enough compromise, since if we're being honest for for a second. There were a few instances where I got lost as well, so I turned on the hint system just to go, oh, that's where I'm supposed to go, before turning it off again, which is something that I very much wished I had access to when playing Super Metroid. Considering how the system seemed to be carried over into Zero Mission later, I personally think it's a perfectly valid way to experience this game if you don't have the patience required. Not everyone wants to skim through the different worlds looking for whichever one happens to contain the room you need to enter.
So if you're going to publicly tweet something like Metroid Prime is cool, but I'm glad that we invented things like fast travel, wayfinding, and maps that are easy to read in the 20-year sense, consider the fact that you might just suck. Consider the fact that Metroid just might not be for you.
Even ignoring the existence of the hint system entirely, it's not like getting lost is too much of an issue with a Metroid game, since there are plenty of hidden collectibles to find like I mentioned before. So being lost is really just an excuse to explore a bit more. Aw man, I have to walk through Chozo Ruins yet again? Man, this sucks. Oh wait, there's a spider ball rail that I can now use, so let me go grab this missile expansion real quick. This sense of discovery is one of the core reasons why this backtrack-centric gameplay even works in the first place, because the game will give you these little hints at abilities you get throughout your adventures. Then by forcing you to return to those areas, your want to gain more missiles or health tanks will inspire you to go out of your way to solve a puzzle or two. The way that the minimap was set up plays into this also, since it'll show you the little hidden crevices or the different rooms you hadn't entered yet, so it'll be in the back of the player's minds rent-free anytime they revisit the room. I see you, Red Door. It's only a matter of time before I find out what secrets you hold. My personal favorite example of this in action are the morph ball tunnels. For the most part, these seem very innocuous, just a cute little tunnel to make you use the morph ball mechanic. But if you peek at the minimap, you will see that the room is extremely tall, and that's because these can hold secret items if you can jump upward in the rooms. Wait a minute, the morph ball can't jump. How are you supposed to get up there? Ninja! The Wii version has a jump feature if you shake the Wii remote. Well, you might not have noticed, but we're not talking about that version! Even if you can't jump in a traditional sense, you can do what the Metroid series does best: bomb. You need to use a trick called bomb jump, which is timing the morph ball bombs just well enough to gain extra height and get up in the room. Mastering the skill in the morph ball tunnels allows you to gain 2 of the energy tanks, which I personally think is absolutely worth doing if you have the patience. It's a tribute to the infinite bomb jumping that was popularized by Super Metroid, while also being a tricky puzzle in its own right, and I personally thought that was cool. So as annoying as having to revisit old areas can definitely be, they did their absolute best to keep exploration interesting throughout your journey. Yeah, that's all good that you think that the backtracking isn't too much of a problem, but I came to this video to hear some complaining. Alright, the system isn't always Mario Sunshine and Roses, and this mainly comes to how the world was designed itself. The backtracking in the first half of the game is honestly pretty fun. Okay, that's not entirely accurate, it's less distracting. Since you're still trying to explore these new areas, the sense of discovery keeps you intrigued as you play. Also, you don't typically have to backtrack very far in order to find new abilities. But once you're in late game and you have to backtrack through a whole world just to find one new room that has an item in it, it does start to feel pretty tedious the more you have to do it. There are only so many secret items you can find on these paths, so eventually you will be left with the table scraps, or nothing at all. So exploring these old areas just consists of you trying to get through and nothing else. But the aspect of the backtracking that I find to be the most grating overall was when you had to move across multiple worlds in order to reach a certain objective. Because of the worlds being interconnected in the way that they are, not every world is directly connected to one another, and you often find yourself having to travel through another world completely just to enter the one that has the area you're trying to visit. This is very much prevalent with Magmore Caverns, which was literally designed as a straight line, and I think it was done on purpose. You can unlock entrances in order to skip having to do some of this tedious traveling, but that doesn't usually happen until very late in the game. Also, once you finally unlock a way to travel between the 3 main areas of the game, you unlock a 4th one, which you can really only enter from Magmore Caverns, so the cycle just begins all over again. The best way to describe this process is like in Pikmin 1. As we all know, a game canon to the Metroid franchise, it would be like if instead of that game being multiple separate areas, it was just one big interconnected map, where in order to grab a treasure in the impact site while starting in the distant spring, you had to walk through the forest navel first, or in other words, extremely goddamn tedious. Magmore Caverns is essentially the hub world in Prime, at least as far as the structure of the game is concerned, and as repetitive as going through the world 57 different times can potentially be, at least the rooms were designed in a way that makes progressing through each area quicker the longer you are into the game. Like this room where you had the morph ball under this gate, but once you get the space jump boots you can just hop over the gate, saving some time. But even with that in place, you're still probably gonna get sick of seeing Magmore Caverns. So although I will acknowledge that backtracking is obviously an integral part of the game's design at the end of the day, it can definitely wear on you if you played the whole game in long marathons like a certain Ninja Store Compass guy did. So either strap yourself in for the long run, or perhaps just allow yourself to put the game down for any period of time, in order to refresh your mind before returning. That might help make the repetition a little less obvious.
It's probably a good time to mention that Metroid Prime doesn't use autosaving, it's manual saving only.
This is definitely an aspect of the game that I could see getting complaints, so let's take a moment to discuss it. First of all, this game does not have any checkpoints, with one very rare exception relating to the game. Much like earlier entries in the series, you are required to manually save every single time. That might sound pretty inconvenient, but honestly the game is fairly generous about providing save rooms. You typically aren't far from one at any given time. They also double as a method of restoring your health, so you will hunt these down regardless. If you end up dying and losing progress, it's usually your fault anyway. That does not change the fact that you will probably get mad at least once or twice during your playthrough due to this. It's undeniable. I can assure you that I have had this happen a number of times throughout my first playthrough of this game as a kid. These days, I usually don't have much of a problem with this approach, since I believe that the tension that builds from needing to pay extra attention to your health at all times fits this game well, since it is about exploring a desolate planet. Would Pikmin 1 still be as memorable without the 30-day time limit? I think not. So I don't typically get mad at the game itself for me losing progress at any point. If the game just gave you a checkpoint too often, like at every elevator or door, then I do think it would be way too easy. But a checkpoint at the bosses specifically would have been fine. As an example, as much as I enjoyed playing through Dread, I do feel like the insistence to add a checkpoint before every single enemy door did take away a lot of the consequence of getting caught. So eventually I just rushed through all of these sections, making me feel like the horror element of this game wasn't as fully realized as I would have hoped. Dying in Dread just felt like a minor inconvenience. Dying in Prime feels like you genuinely lost something. So as tragic as it can be to have to replay a chunk of your playthrough for making a mistake like that, I think it also doubles as a learning opportunity to remain careful throughout your playthrough. The game even uses this against you at multiple parts in the game, which I will save for later in this video. Although that doesn't mean that the system is flawless in execution. Even without losing significant game progress, it does mean that you have the potential to lose your logbook data, which is much more of a problem. Trying to scan every enemy and important lore file is already pretty tedious on its own, so trying to retrace your steps and remember every single thing you just lost could definitely piss someone off. I do think it would have been better if you could at least keep that whenever you respawn, since it is inconsequential to the main quest of the game, and would lead to way less frustration. Now that I've gotten that behemoth of a topic out of the way finally, let's go over one of the most memorable parts of the game. But before that, let me grab this wave beam real quick. Wait, what's going on? Yep, it's time to cover the bosses in Prime.
I briefly mentioned the Parasite Queen before, so I should probably go back and talk about that one in more detail. Or I could just talk about the ones I actually have opinions on.
Let's start with the mini bosses first. These are very common early on in the game, and mainly just exist to give the player a unique little challenge to fight in order to get one of the unlockable items. They can be defeated in a fairly short amount of time, sometimes less than 20 seconds if you know exactly how to fight them. Like the plated beetle, for example, which simply requires a well-timed sidestep as it charges at you, and a few missiles fired into its bright red posterior. I do like how many of these mini bosses are just the game taking one of the common enemies in the game, adding some new element to them that requires a higher amount of strategy. Like how this one has a very shiny helmet that your bullets will bounce off. This is also true of the She-God, which I showcased a little bit ago, where instead of its back being extremely vulnerable like the baby She-Gods you fight before, instead its back is covered in crystals that will absorb all of your beam weapons. So you either need to precisely attack its mouth with missiles, or you can turn into the morph ball in order to bomb its underside, which I believe is the only time that the morph ball bombs are really utilized during a boss fight in this game. I, for one, really appreciate this type of scaling enemy design in video games. Like, maybe you could say it's a bit lazy to just have the normal enemy and then a strong version of the normal enemy as a boss fight, but I don't know, I always found it more charming than anything. I see it in the same light as the way that Monkey Ball stages slowly evolve in the first game. You have conveyors in Advance, which is a fairly easy stage, but in Expert you have conveyor parts, which completely changes the way that the stage plays and makes it significantly more difficult. I view these boss enemies in a similar light, which is helped by the game adding the two of these as overworld enemies later on in the game, which you need to backtrack to these areas for late game items. Although the She-God in particular really loves to shake the ground, causing Samus to constantly fall down when I'm trying to platform out of this room. God damn it! I hope you get the idea by now, since I'm not going to cover every starting mini-boss, since I would like to have some free time in my life again. Like, wow, you need to defeat all these red war-offs that spin around you for the missile expansion? It's so difficult, I'm going to cry. It's not that bad, just look at the radar, it makes it 10 times easier. In reality, the real stars of the show are the main bosses, the penultimate test of skill at the end of each of the worlds. Except for Megmore Caverns, which has none. Yeah, I'm not kidding. You know, when I said that it was essentially the hub world earlier, that was just a hunch, but I think it might just genuinely be the reality. Anyway, let's begin with the boss of the Chozo Ruins, Flagra, who has an exceptionally goofy name. Seriously, it sounds like someone trying to do the Sega chant while doing the Chubby Bunny challenge.
Believe it or not, this boss actually has one of the more interesting character arcs of the game.
While previously exploring Chozo Ruins, you may have noticed how all of the plant life is completely dead, and all of the water in the world is toxic to the touch. This comes across as a bit of an innocuous detail until you begin to scan the lore entries on the walls, which mention a great poison that corrupted the Chozo to the point of madness. At the same time, it mentions a wellspring of pure water at the highest point of ruins, which flows water throughout the area. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that Flagra is responsible. One important aspect to the boss battles in Metroid games in general, but especially in Prime, is the idea that the bosses aren't as much of a giant, extreme fight that requires you to be on your toes 24/7, but instead just a giant puzzle that you need to figure out. Which I know is like 99% of the gameplay already, but what makes the bosses somewhat unique is that they center around utilizing a specific power-up that you would have recently acquired. In this case, you need to utilize the Morph Ball bombs in order to activate switches that electrocute it. But unfortunately, with this boss being one giant plant, it's utilizing the power of the sun to remain invulnerable to weapon fire. And it's using its tentacles to cover the Morph Ball holes, keeping you from damaging it.
For just its feet. I hope.
Alright, so how do you defeat this boss then? Well, it's powered by the sun, so what better way to remove some of its power than shooting these solar panels that hang from the ceiling? Haha, take that. No more sun for you. Wait, you can't knock them back down. That's cheating. Well, if I can't kill you with the weapons at my disposal, I'll just keep firing at you until you get stunned. Can't knock out the solar panels now, can you? Boom! It's fairly straightforward. Just make sure to book it once the boss is stunned, since you have a very limited amount of time before the boss wakes up. It moves the solar panels back. With each hit, more solar panels are activated, requiring you to get pretty efficient at hitting the panels quickly. My professional technique for this boss is to abuse the dodge move while walking on in order to move across the arena quicker than normal walking. You could also just use the Morph Ball, but then you have to deal with the long transition animation, which take up much more time. And with that being said, I think this is an excellent first major boss. It requires a decent amount of micromanaging skills, and I think the problem-solving aspect of the fight makes it much more rewarding. As a player, you feel like you outsmarted the boss itself, which in my opinion makes the boss battles very memorable in a way that a lot of shooters struggle with. Also, once you defeat this boss, all of the water in the Chozo Ruins returns to normal, and you no longer take damage when walking through it. A very nice attention to detail that also opens up a few more exploration options in the area as well. I think it's a very well thought out touch. Moving on to the ice boss, we have Phardas, a boss made up entirely of rocks. There was actually one pretty interesting detail about this boss that I'll go on a quick tangent about. Alongside the release of Metroid Prime, there was a comic book adaptation in Nintendo Power issues around the same time. There are 3 8-page long mini-comics that span from volume 164 to 166. The one of interest though comes from 165, which showcases Samus's fight against Phardas. But interestingly enough, it actually takes place in Chozo Ruins rather than Phendrana Drifts, which I find particularly fascinating. Was this boss supposed to be in a different area but was changed at some point, or was this some kind of error on behalf of the team responsible for making these promotional comics? I personally believe that it's neither. With this being a 24-page comic series that needs to go over a fairly wide amount of content in this game, I think they prioritized showcasing Chozo Ruins since it is the most major world of the game, and it was much easier to choose Phardas as the boss of choice since I had a whopping 3 whole pages to showcase the boss fight. Trying to showcase the Flagra fight would have been borderline impossible within that amount of time. Having a rock-based boss in Chozo Ruins still makes plenty of sense in the context of showcasing the game off. Anyway, that's tangent number 17 over. Back to your regularly scheduled boss fight. This one exists to utilize the thermal visor, which allows you to see certain enemies in the dark. I didn't mention it before this point since honestly it's pretty situational and kind of mediocre, so I didn't really have much to say about it. Then after enough fire, they will explode, blocking out your visor, making you switch back to your combat visor in order to destroy the rock segment. After it takes enough damage, the boss will curl up into its own ball form, mimicking your morph ball. You're intended to dodge this by rolling away, but I almost always get hit anyway while entering the morph ball, no matter how early I activate it. Come on, come on, come on! I'm fairly certain that you were intended to use a super missile on this boss as well, mainly due to this rock throwing attack that it has, which will drop health and ammo when destroyed. You know, honestly, this boss seems suspiciously similar to Bouldergeist from Mario Galaxy. Both bosses are giant rock creatures with some sort of supernatural element to them. Both throw rocks at the player as a primary form of attack, and they're both the major boss from the third area of the game. It might seem like a stretch beyond belief, but Galaxy 1 did release 5 years after Prime, so I would not put it past them to take some inspiration. Also, when I was double checking the Mario wiki to make sure I wasn't crazy, I saw that the trivia section of the wiki literally states that Bouldergeist is, quote, similar to Phardas in the Metroid game Metroid Prime. So I am right! Lucky. The only thing that the Prime boss is missing are the shadow boos that you use to attack. But those are replaced with the boos coming from me, since this boss fight is kind of whatever to be honest. Listen, on its own it's fine. I enjoyed playing it, but when compared to a giant plant monster that requires me to take it down using intense electrical shocks, it's not really as special of an experience. It also didn't help that after beating this boss, I managed to die later on in my playthrough, only to spawn again with the boss undefeated, requiring me to beat it a second time. The bosses of Metroid Prime are undoubtedly well designed, and I do very much love playing them. Even if it's mainly for the expectation of getting a new power up at my disposal, I can still remember every boss I fought in Metroid Prime. But enemies from the Halo series, what Metroid Prime is supposedly ripping off? Can you even remember a single enemy name from that game without googling it? Nicholas? What do you mean Elite? Grunt, the Flood, the Brutes, alright, this bit's getting old. You know what, you win, Halo fans. For now.
Alright, so we're 28 pages into the script now, and obviously we're not even close to done. I think it goes without saying that I would highly recommend that you go out and play this game for yourself. And now that we're this far in, we're going to be reaching what I like to call the spoiler zone, which basically means I'm going to be going into more detail about certain areas of the game that I glossed over for the sake of spoilers. So if you haven't played this game yet, I implore that you stop watching here, or I'll put a timestamp on screen to a conclusion section if you don't want to get spoiled on the more finer details of the game. But for the rest of you, or those who simply don't care, we're going to be going into detail as to why I like specific parts of this game in detail.
Now before we move on to discuss the final area of the game, Phazon Mines, I want to cover some moments in the game that I thought were worth highlighting during my playthrough, both of which being key areas to the game's story. I mentioned the thermal visor briefly during the boss section, but I didn't mention how you acquire it. That's because it's found in the space pirate base in Phendrana Drifts, which is an extremely interesting location to analyze. I already covered that this game doesn't tell its story in a traditional sense, more so choosing to allocate its plot for the many scannable log files around you. The space pirate bases are probably the main exceptions to that. These areas are the main hotspots for plot development throughout the game. You first enter the base after completing this water raising puzzle, and you see a door that is completely grayed out, with no apparent means to open it. So logically you turn to open the way beam door next to you, which is most likely the newest power up you have acquired by this point in your playthrough. Walking in, you see this turret begin to fire on the player from around the corner. Pretty standard at this point, so you begin to fire on it like usual, when all of a sudden, a space pirate cloaked in shadow jumps in from the left side of the room and starts to attack you, catching you off guard. Continuing forward into the next room, the door is locked from behind you, then space pirates begin rushing into the room to ambush Samus. At this moment, you know that something has gone wrong, and after a few more rooms, you reach some sort of lab setting, with large test tubes and monitors showing some sort of data streams. After ambushing the space pirates in this room, you could continue on the ambush mode of space pirates, but if you instead decide to pull out the scan visor to investigate what the space pirates are researching, it gets much darker. These are shared via the pirate data portion of the logbook, so all you need to look for is the red scanning symbols in order to read these. They start out innocuous enough, explaining how the space pirates occupied Town 4 in order to mine Phazon, but then you find the log files explaining what they're using the Phazon for, which includes some pretty morbid details. They are exposing the local wildlife to Phazon, making them extremely volatile and strong. Also, they can use them as weapons when they invade other planets. It also includes this subtle lines just to really paint a picture of the nature of these experiments.
Our methods will have to be refined. We currently have a 100% extinction rate after the 4th infusion period, and most survivors of the 3rd infusion stage are so violent and uncontrollable that they have to be euthanized.
Very chilling. Wild to think that this is in a Nintendo game of all things. The only other series I can think of that gets to this level of darkness is Pikmin, which sounds like a joke, but I'm serious. If you don't get all those treasures in time, the Omar fucking dies. Moving on, these space pirates are absolutely depraved and clearly need to be taken care of before whatever Phazon related plan they have on their way can be completed. So you continue through very dark and well guarded rooms, and after reading more and more about the space pirates' plan for dominating this planet, you start to feel pretty pissed off at the atrocities they've committed. So the game decides that this is the best opportunity to give you the super missile. And hey look, an elevator that leads to a scripted combat sequence. It would be a shame if Samus happened to have full missiles at this exact moment. Seriously though, even on hard mode, a super missile will obliterate a space pirate in one hit. Even the flying ones, which get introduced here, who proceed to straight up dive bomb Samus upon being defeated. Damn, they are dedicated to protect whatever research is happening here. Which brings us a few rooms forward, where we get introduced to a familiar face, Metroids. You know, some might say it's a bit unorthodox to introduce the main character several hours into the game, but I'll allow it. Either way, Metroids spell bad news if you add a couple letters, so naturally you're going to need to scan a test tube to investigate. They've been infused with Phazon. Uh-oh.
It'll be fine. They're in this protective tubing. Nothing can ever go wrong. Ah!
Fighting Metroids isn't too bad or anything. They will lunge at you occasionally, then you'll have to panic and morph ball bomb them off. But as long as you're comfortable enough with the dodge mechanic by now, then you should be fine enough to blast them. I see the developers have played Half-Life as well, and after blasting through more of this dimly lit base, making sure to fire a missile at this tube in order to get this energy tank so you don't miss it like I did as a kid, then you enter a tall cylindrical room known as the research core, which houses the thermal visor. It's locked behind several barriers though, and after a shootout that requires you to scan 3 separate terminals as you slowly lower to ground level, you see power leak from the door above you. Then the room itself becomes pitch black. Unable to see, and the only nearby door being frozen shut, this is the perfect opportunity for the space pirates to ambush Samus. But they fail to realize that Samus isn't the prey.
She's a hunter. Okay, fine, she's also the predator. Nobody appreciates my jokes.
After making your way up the stairs, you have to use the wave beam to power up the door again so you can exit. And trying to fight your way back out of space, even with the thermal visor, is hard. Your visibility is still really limited, so trying to actually navigate backwards through space while getting pelted by space pirate bullets is rough. I died in this part a fair few times even though I knew where I was going. It might be good at finding out where the enemies are located, but that does not mean that the environment itself is easy to see. It's very disorienting trying to make your way around, which is obviously done on purpose in order to make this part of the game goddamn terrifying, which is definitely effective if you ever plan on playing this part in hard mode, but with enough persistence you will get through. This section introduces you to electronically activated switches, which you can only see with the thermal visor on, finally allowing you to restore power to the great outdoor you saw outside the base. I really love this section of the game in my casual playthrough since it helps establish the villainous motivation for the space pirates' involvement in the plot, and gives context as to why you find the space pirate frigate above Talonfall in the intro to the game itself. It's also just an extremely moody environment that leans much more into the horror side of Metroid, which isn't really as prevalent in Prime. Most of the unnerving details seen after the intro reside in the log files themselves, which makes this part really stick out in my mind. And if you don't religiously scan everything, you can still understand what's going on. Space pirates are up to no good and you need to stop them. Speaking of the frigate from the intro, once you acquire the ice beam and backtrack to the Talon overworld, you'll find a massive crashed spaceship with space pirates surrounding it, which seems awfully familiar. As you approach this suspicious ship, you will find space pirates near the entrance that are fatally wounded, mimicking the intro to the game. And notably, this is the only time that these specific variants of the space pirates are reused in the entire game. So we need to dive into what happened to this place, since it's flooded. It's also incredibly destroyed due to the whole, exploding thing from before. Power is almost completely out in this section, requiring the use of the thermal visor to power up doors as you wave your way through. One very notable room is the reactor core, which was the Parasite Queen room from the intro. In place of the giant tank that used to house the boss is now a series of scrap metal floating in the air towards the ceiling. Your goal is to enter through the locked door that you initially used to enter the boss room during the intro to the game, but with it missing power you need to locate 4 separate thermal switches scattered around the room, which requires you to climb the aforementioned metal panels in order to reach the highest switch. With this whole room being underwater, your movement and jumping ability is severely limited, meaning that even jumping up one of these requires a lot of precision with how you time your jumps to make sure you don't undershoot it and fall all the way back down. Although that's a non-issue when compared to these enemies that will suck you towards them when you get close. What are they called? Gel Zap? Well, at least I know what to yell next time they screw me over. What makes these especially annoying is that you need to be ready with a charge shot from miles away, since you can only harm them once they've already activated. And you do not have the time to get an attack in if you're caught off guard. God damn it, Gel Zap! Even with that said though, what made me really remember this part of the game was the music. This room in particular introduces what I consider to be the best song in the entire game. Sonically, it captures a very calming and spaced out vibe, and it resembles many ever water level OSTs in this way, Liquid Mode from My Odyssey being the closest example I can think of off of memory. But unlike the very uplifting, joyous instrumentation of that song, this one has a sad undertone to it, almost like the track itself reflects on the morbid nature of exploring the crashed frigate. It feels rare to return to derelict versions of locations in games in general, but they always succeed in getting an emotional response out of me. The only other example I could think of in gaming is Cinnabar Island from Pokemon. In Generation 1, it's an island town with 33 people, and has this very upbeat, cheery song to it which matches the vibe. But in Generation 2, when you return to this area in the post-game, you find that the island has been erupted over, with the island only containing a single Pokemon Center, and the happy song of the original has been replaced with a slowed down, downbeat version of the original, as if the game itself is reflecting on the blunt reality of the situation. This is genuinely the saddest song I think I've ever heard. Pokemon of all things almost made me cry. That is powerful. That could be a stretch, but I don't know, the first time I heard this song while calmly jumping up these platforms, it kinda blew my mind. It left an impression on me that I still remember to this day, which is why I think this particular room stood out in my mind during the playthrough. Once you enter the door you just powered, you enter yet another room you need to power up, with a save point nearby, which makes sense since it was there in the intro. Let's just stroll up to the next room and hop over this elevator here. Uh-oh, why can't I get up? I have to backtrack? That means I have to slowly platform up the entire water-filled ship again after just going down.
Man, wait. That's why they put the save point there!
They knew people were gonna get annoyed and stop playing for the day after seeing that. Whatever, at least you can get an energy tank, so that sort of makes up for it in a way. The developers were definitely trolling, you cannot convince me otherwise. Either way, I've stalled for long enough. It's time to finally enter Phazon Mines, the fourth and last area of the game, technically, but we'll cross that bridge later. This is the main base of operations for the space pirates. It was vaguely mentioned in the pirate logs I went over previously, but this is where they get the Phazon that they use for their experiments, hence the name. Basing this last world on a mine also completely changes how it's structured. Now instead of being one flat area, it's vertically oriented. This game even separates it into 3 different levels, making this the most obviously linear part of the game. Now I don't want to bore you by going over this entire world in extreme detail since I just did that with the previous 2 sections, so I would try to keep this as brief as possible, if that's even going to be doable. This starts off simple enough, requiring you to disable a force field in order to enter. Then you get ambushed by some turrets with essentially no cover. Now you could just try to destroy them and likely lose a ton of health in the process. However, something I didn't realize until this point in the playthrough is that all of these rooms have a control panel you can scan in order to disable the turrets, giving you a passive means of escape. I was wondering why I hadn't noticed this feature before, and I think it's because the only other part of this game where you can do this, to my knowledge at least, is the space frigate from the intro. And even then, aside from this one during the escape sequence, the panel you need to scan is pretty damn subtle. Either way, I like this inclusion since it's yet another way the scan visor is goated to the players that choose to utilize it to its full potential. Moving on, you next have to defeat some stealth troopers, nothing new, just use the good old ice beam to missile combo like always. Everything is all well and good until the game introduces you to the new enemy type, the trooper pirates. They use reverse engineered versions of Samus's beam weapons, which are represented by their color, and are invincible to all weapon fire. Well, except for the beam that they're imitating, which seems pretty counterintuitive. I do think the trooper pirates inclusion this late into the game does add a lot to this world. By this point, you have defeated so many space pirates that it's pretty much just become second nature. By forcing you to utilize the different beams in this way, it adds some extra variety to the combat. I've been using the ice beam as a crutch for hours by this point, so having to figure out how to dodge enemy fire and effectively use the wave beam against a group of 3 troopers at once takes some figuring out. Now granted, the wave beam's primary use is for stunning enemies, so you have plenty of time to get the free charge shots in. The power beam trooper is much more annoying though. Since it's the weakest beam weapon in the game, they can be a pretty giant pain to take care of, at least until you discover that super missiles work just fine against them. Bye-bye! There is another major new enemy introduced here as well. Remember how I mentioned before that the space pirates were experimenting with infusing Phazon into creatures to make them more volatile and powerful? Well, that didn't end with just the random enemies throughout the game. In true barbaric fashion, the space pirates were also combining Phazon with their own embryos to see if they could become unstoppable.
If you think that exposing your own kind to a substance that's known to cause several adverse effects might violate several galactic laws, well, there is this nice little space pirate log that the game gives that expands on this. An entire shift of dynamo workers have been transferred following bouts of Phazon madness. Units have reported to science team for use in laboratory studies and the new elite pirate program. Their dementia will make them adequate training adversaries for the elite team. What the fuck?
These elite pirates are definitely the most intimidating enemy encounter in my opinion. You see this giant behemoth of an enemy trapped in a tank, only for it to wake up and immediately break out with virtually no effort. With this added power, they are immune to normal beam fire for the most part. In fact, it will shield itself from all beam power altogether. That's fine. No one is immune to the immense power of the ice beam. Oh shit. In all seriousness, the elite pirate is actually pretty simple to take down. The energy shield may keep you from just firing off a willy-nilly, but if you wait until the boss goes to attack the floor, then it gives you a perfect opportunity for attack. 2 super missiles and bam, the elite pirate has now been reduced to ashes. The elite pirate is an oddity of sorts, since it feels like a mini boss and you know it's really not, although you really even fight these as far as I could tell. There is the first encounter that I just went over, then one goes to attack you while backtracking a little later on, then that's it I think? I guess they were limited with how many of these they could fit into the map without it becoming too much of a gimmick, but that still feels kind of low. It definitely felt like I fought more than 2, so in that sense I think they succeeded in their goal. I haven't really touched on this before, but Phazon Mines is difficult. Seriously, I had several of the anti-tanks by this point, and I was still worried about dying before I reached the save point. Seriously, the game doesn't give you a single save point until you are 4.5 deep. Within that time, you need to fight several waves of the trooper pirates, one of the elite pirates, and this half-pipe room full of puffers. So by the time that you get to the central dynamo, you are hanging on by a thread. So you'd assume that the game would give you some kind of break by this point. You know, just let the player enter the nearby save point. Well, no! The door to the save room is locked off. Then the game decides to introduce the worst mini-boss in the game, the cloaked drone. Now, I haven't gone over the drone enemies by this point, since I'm lazy, but to give a quick rundown, they're extremely aggressive and take a lot of firepower to take down. So imagine the experience of fighting that, but with no health, you're stressed out, and you can't lock onto the enemy itself. Fighting the cloaked drone was an absolutely miserable experience. The worst part is that since it's an enemy that you can't see, you would assume that as the player you need to activate the thermal visor, you know, since it's the whole reason why it's in the game anyway. But not in this one fight in the game. You need to get good and learn how to free aim and hit this sentry with literally no health. This really goes to show why the lock-on system was added to the game in the first place, because if it wasn't, the combat would be so annoying. Whatever, so you barely win the fight, actually shaking and crying since you need to save very badly. So cool, let's go grab the power bomb. Well, in the Metroid Prime moment of old time, you can't acquire the power bomb without a little morph ball puzzle. There is an electric maze that you need to navigate with multiple visible puddles, which will disable some of the electric barrier when morph ball bombed. Do this a few times, then you get the power bomb and can finally breathe. This might not seem particularly stressful, but it's really easy to over-input during this part since each corner is rounded. Combine this with the pure anxiety of not wanting to lose an hour of progress, and this last puzzle becomes nerve-wracking very quickly. But it's still pretty easy as long as you take it slowly. Phazon Mines does not pull any punches whatsoever, and you know what? I very much respect it. Metroid has had a strong amount of horror influence. Sure, you got the Emmys from Dread being the most obvious example, but with the way that Phazon Mines is structured, you have no choice but to play it carefully in order to succeed, which forces someone as stubborn as me to tread carefully with the combat interactions. In this way, the first half of Phazon Mines turns Metroid Prime into more of a survival horror game, which is the bold choice that I can more than respect. When I thought that I was at my most safe and powerful, the game gave me a huge ego check right out of the gate, doing this in a way that doesn't come across as gimmicky or cheap, which I think says more than anything.
Alright, so we just found a new power-up and there's no clear way to proceed for the next room. You know what that means. Say it with me. It's time to backtrack.
In this case, we need to acquire the X-ray visor, which really means going back through Phazon Mines to reach Magmore Caverns to Talon Overworld to grab the visor, which as I mentioned before is supposed to be the replacement for the X-ray scope from Super Metroid, since the scan visor replaced the main use that the item provided. Instead, the main use for the X-ray visor is to see hidden platforms and breakable objects. When you have the visor equipped, the world is completely monochrome, looking like when you disable textures on an emulator or something. In my opinion, it can be pretty hard to tell what you're looking at most of the time, although it's much easier to see rooms in the dark than the thermal visor, so I pretty much stopped using the thermal visor by this point, which is not helped by the X-ray visor also allowing you to see a few more enemy types in the late game. So rest in peace the thermal visor, you were useless. Although the X-ray visor is required mainly for progressing deeper into the Phazon Mines, there are plenty of opportunity with backtracking to previous areas for collectibles. I'll point out Talon Overworld for this example. You can use a hidden platform to access this missile expansion hidden behind a tree. All well and good. Well, and probably my favorite attention to detail moment in this game, if you look really closely, you can see the rain bouncing off the spot that the platform is supposed to be. So if you have a keen eye when first entering this room, you can grab that missile expansion without even needing the visor, but it's just subtle enough where most people won't notice it, which is why I admire the decision to include that so much. But getting back on track, after backtracking through the mines to acquire the grapple beam, you return the platform over a Phazon-filled room full of Metroids using the hidden platforms. This eventually leads to a series of hallways where, oh, you need the Phazon beam. Let's just pretend I didn't need to backtrack yet again real quick. Why didn't they make the area door red? Would have saved me like 30 minutes, but whatever. At least the puzzle here is quite interesting. It requires you to use the grapple beam combined with these boost ball switches to slowly raise a series of platforms. Once you reach the final switch, it becomes time to raise the roof. Oh, it's just a morph ball puzzle. It's relatively basic, just avoid getting hit until you reach the door, but I won't lie, the novelty of being able to roll around these flat spider ball planes is more than enough to make me like the sequence. It also helps that this is the only moment in the game I can remember that you use the spider ball freely instead of it being a set path for a shortcut or missile expansion. Alright, now that we've gone on that long tangent, time to actually make some progress. After entering the previously mentioned red door, you will enter a series of hallways covered in Phazon and giant mushrooms that require you to use the grapple beam to get through. There are several hunter Metroids flying around, which are pretty much normal Metroids but with more health, and they will try to latch onto you with grapple beam like tentacles and drag you off the mushrooms. But it gets even worse with the next room. You won't believe how frustrating this room is. I could talk about it for literal hours.
Okay, let's begin, but first I'm gonna check the word count in the script real quick. Excuse me? Oh, we don't have time for this. Fine, I'm just gonna take this rant and put it over here, and we're just gonna skip to the boss city area.
Remember those elite pirates I mentioned before? Well, here is the Omega Pirate. What makes it different? Well, for one, you still have to use the same wait for an attack before you can fire approach as the elite, but rather than getting damaged immediately, it has extra armor. So you need to attack one of the 4 malleable Phazon infused spots on its body in order to create an opening for an attack. Once it takes enough damage, it'll get nervous and disappear while spawning a small wave of the trooper pirates of varying colors. Then once you get an opening, you need to immediately activate the X-ray visor since the boss will be standing in a pile of Phazon and open to attack. Although you have to be quick with defeating the enemies, since the boss isn't on the Phazon piles for very long. This boss is fairly challenging, which makes sense since it's pretty late into the game. Even so, as someone who has beaten this game close to 3 times just writing the script, as long as you know the best methods for taking down each trooper pilot quickly, then you should be fine. Honestly, I found the arena itself to be much more irritating to deal with than the boss, since the amount of walkable ground that isn't covered in Phazon is smaller than you think it is, which makes it harder to keep distance with the boss while trying to attack it. I felt way more claustrophobic fighting this boss than I did fighting the elite pirates, despite those rooms being much smaller. The ever main issue with this boss, which is more of a nitpick honestly, is that the boss lasts a pretty lengthy amount of time, especially if you're inexperienced with fighting it. When I first played this game, I absolutely hated this boss, but these days, even if I do think it's one of the weaker boss fights, I still think it's interesting enough to forgive it a little. With the defeat of the Omega Pirate, we finally acquired a Phazon suit, the final suit upgrade in the game. It allows you to walk on Phazon without taking damage, and also looks absolutely stunning. The shiny silver and black color scheme, combined with the red glow of it all, just screams sports car in the best possible way. Seriously, this is probably the best looking suit in the entire franchise. Although I'm not a huge fan of this weird force field effect around the suit. I get it's supposed to represent some kind of Phazon effect, but it just looks like Samus has a stroke effect from Photoshop applied at all times. Now that you've acquired the Phazon suit, well, you need to go back to Talon 4 in order to reach the Artifact Temple, which is located near the landing site. This area is available once you acquire a missile, but I never understood what its purpose was until I was this far in. But assuming that you're like me and just entered this area for the first time, this is when you get introduced to the artifacts. Now remember how I brought up earlier that people really don't like backtracking in games like this, and how I thought that they handled it in a way that still encouraged you to explore your surroundings? Well, the artifacts take that opinion, curl it up in a ball, and throw it into the nearest trash can, since as it turns out, the game requires 12 different artifacts to be found before you can progress in the game, all scattered around the 4 worlds you just thoroughly explored. Now each pillar can be scanned, giving the player hints as to where the artifact will be, usually with the world and exact room you need to enter being directly mentioned. It's not exactly very hard to figure out what these are, but it doesn't change the fact that in essence, it's yet another form of forced backtracking. Except instead of being hidden in the design of the world itself, it's instead shoved directly in the player's face clear as day.
Oh, you wanted to beat the game since you explored every world? Screw attack yourself.
In defense of the developers, most of these artifacts are located in areas that you haven't explored before, so your natural curiosity would have most likely drawn you to them anyway, and you can acquire a large majority of these before you've acquired to. For example, in my playthrough I had collected 9 of these before I'd reached this point, which would normally be some kind of flex, except that means I now have to look through several hours of gameplay in order to find examples of me collecting these while editing this.
Gee, thanks.
The most obvious example of an artifact that you can collect early is the Artifact of Strength, located in the Warrior Shrine, which you access by jumping on this platform above the entrance of Phendrana Drifts and activating one boost ball switch. It's the easiest to obtain early on in the game, so I imagine most players found this one by accident. Another one in a similar vein that personally annoyed me greatly is this pillar in the lava lake, located only a handful of rooms away. All you have to do to collect it is fire a super missile at the larger of the 2 pillars in the room, then boom, artifact. Easy, right? Well, for some unknown reason to me, the game seems to prevent you from breaking this pillar until late game. Since on this particular playthrough I tried to grab it early since I knew where it was, but for some reason I couldn't get the super missile to destroy it, but I randomly attempted it later in the game and it suddenly worked. It's possible that I was at the wrong angle since one side of the pillar does look much weaker than the other, but I don't know, this really annoyed me, so I felt like venting about it, okay? As far as the other artifacts go, they can range wildly in quality. Most simply require you to enter rooms with Phazon beam doors or require the X-ray visor in some way, like this one found at Phendrana's edge. At first, you may end up being extremely confused where the artifact is supposed to be, since all you can find at first is the power bomb expansion. So after running around this room several times trying to figure out what random corner was thrown in, you'll probably end up just doing what I did, giving up and looking it up in a walkthrough.
What? I didn't say I wouldn't.
What you'll find is that you're supposed to use the X-ray visor to find a hidden door behind a wall, which has absolutely no indication that anything's behind it whatsoever. Yeah, this game decided to pull a Super Metroid right at the end of the game and hide something behind a literally random wall. Considering how little you need to use the X-ray visor for this purpose throughout the game, this really feels like it comes out of nowhere. But whatever, I'll just be glad this game only pulls this one time. It could have been way worse otherwise. In an effort to keep this section free from becoming too long-winded, I'll go over probably the most interesting artifact from Phazon Mines, being the Elite Pirate Alpha. Don't remember this variant of the Elite Pirate? It's the first one you see inside a stasis tank in Elite Research, appearing to be much more infected by Phazon than even the Omega Pirate. Speaking of Elite Research, the hint for this specific artifact says the following.
A room of research lies within the mines. A corrupted invader is trapped there. Defeat this creature to claim the artifact of Warrior.
With the word research being highlighted, which is a blatant hint at the room where you find the artifact. So here's a funny story. When I saw that hint, I decided to enter Omega Research instead, which has 2 elite pirates sitting in stasis tanks. The only 2 that you can't fight.
That's because they weren't normal space pirates. They were pirating Nintendo games. Once they find you, you never escape.
So yeah, as you could probably imagine, I spent way too long running around this room trying to open these canisters, only to find out how dumb I was later. And I don't know whether to blame Retro for using the word research, even though it applies to multiple rooms, or to blame myself, since Elite Research is earlier in the world.
Oh wait, I forgot to talk about the difference this has with the normal Elite Pirate fight. Let's begin.
It's essentially the same fight as the Elite Pirates, but it attacks faster.
That was quick.
Alright, I think you get the point. The artifacts are somewhat tedious to get, even if they promote exploration, so let's just move forward and finally talk about the end boss.
Actually, I want to talk about one more thing before we continue. Okay. I'll keep it brief, I promise.
I wasn't really sure where to put this in a script, but there is one last type of collectible that I feel the need to talk about, being the charge combos. Back when I mentioned the super missile, I brought up how you activate it by charging the power beam and hitting the missile button in order to fire an ultra powered attack. You might have been wondering if something similar also applied to different beam weapons as well. They do, in the form of the Wave Buster, the Ice Spreader, and the Flamethrower, which are optional, fairly well hidden power-ups meant to be collected late into the game. The only interesting one to get is the Wave Buster, which can be collected the earliest, only requiring the Wave Beam and Spider Ball to enter the room. But in order to climb the room, you need to destroy 3 floors with 4 blocks each in order to lower the ceiling, requiring an absolute minimum of 36 missiles. So you better have stocked up by this point. This can definitely be annoying if you're bad at aiming, since a lot of the blocks have oculuses on them, which drain missiles quickly. But once you've collected the Wave Buster, you'll notice how there are actually 2 separate types of charge combo abilities. The Super Missile and Ice Spreader are one powerful shot that uses 5 and 10 missiles respectively, while the Wave Spreader and Flamethrower start by using 10 missiles, but shoot out a constant stream of energy that drains 5 missiles a second. So if you aren't grabbing missile expansions constantly, then these are practically unusable, and honestly, I think the latter are pretty much useless in most situations. This late into the game, you've already figured out optimal tactics for defeating enemies, so this really just becomes overkill. Also, it isn't really worth wasting several missiles stunning an enemy when you can literally just use the Ice Beam for the same purpose. I guess it's useful against the Wave Troopers in the intro of Phazon Mines, but I think that might be the only real value you get out of the Wave Buster in the entire game. In fact, I enjoyed using the Flamethrower so much that I forgot to record footage of me using it during my playthrough, and I had to open the game again just to show you this footage. In my opinion, except for the pure fun of exploring the world and collecting the items, unless you're going for 100%, the only one you should really bother getting is the Ice Spreader, since it absolutely destroys the Ice Troopers in Phazon Mines, which I definitely talked about earlier. No, don't go back in the video to check. After several hours, we have finally acquired all the artifacts and can finally activate the artifact towers and get to the bottom of what the space pilots are researching. Oh hey, Metal Ridley! Remember him? No? For some reason, despite being one of the primary antagonists of the game, you barely see Ridley at all. Normally this would be to build some kind of suspense, give the player some anticipation as they slowly hype themselves up for this big boss fight, but that doesn't really happen either. All you see of Ridley up until this point is the first encounter in the intro, and a shot of Ridley flying overhead in Phendrana drifts, which happened for me a little over 2 hours into my playthrough.
I guess Metroid really needed to take a nap. for 8 hours.
In actuality, the space pirates are the real subject of interest for the majority of the game, and Meta Ridley really just exists for pure novelty. This fight should feel like a big moment in the game. Sam is facing off against her big rival yet again in a monumental duel. But to me, it felt kind of unearned. It comes across like the devs adding a Ridley fight because that's just a thing that happens in Metroid games. I don't know, this is getting kind of rambly. Maybe the boss fight will speak for itself. Since Ridley is now covered in armor plating, you know, the meta part of Meta Ridley, they have become almost completely immune to weapon fire, with the exception of his chest plate, which you can only damage while Ridley is stunned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, let's go over the different phases of the boss fight chronologically. The first of which I'll dub the flying phase, where Ridley will fly in from far away to attack you by either launching some rockets from standstill, or by flying by and dropping bombs in the arena. Dodging these isn't too bad the first few times, since the artifact statues will protect you for the most part. At least until Ridley lands on the platform and destroys all of them before flying back into the air, which is the third attack of this phase. But even then, this is actually a lot easier than it seems. Whenever Ridley hovers next to the platform, they are very open to attack for a good chunk of time. So simply shoot a super missile every time you can, and make sure to sidestep around to dodge the bombs that get dropped, and this first phase is relatively straightforward. Once you get the health bar down to 1/8 of its original size, Ridley will land on the stage for good, and this is when the
Milk turns sour.
immediately it becomes significantly more claustrophobic.
Sakurai was right after all!
At this moment, Ridley begins to charge at the player repeatedly, with very little time to react and dodge. If you don't lock on and dodge immediately, then you will get hit. And Ridley does not hold any punches. If you're not careful, then your health will drain extremely fast in this part. Eventually, they'll stop and scream at you, which gives you an opportunity to get some shots in, with enough damage to Ridley's face stunning him, allowing you to damage the chest plate. This part of the boss could take a long while, since you have a very slim opportunity to get hits on Ridley, which makes getting a stun in very rare, with the window being just long enough to get a super missile in if you time it just right. This boss will likely take a fair few tries before you complete it, but as long as you've collected enough energy tanks by this point, then you have a pretty wide margin of error. I don't mean to brag or anything, but I absolutely smoked Meta Ridley in this playthrough. I need to finish this video, Ridley, get out of my way! With Meta Ridley getting Black Panther off the battle arena, we can finally enter the final area of the game, the Impact Crater. It takes place very deep underground, and it's been completely deformed by Phazon to the point of looking very fleshy and organic, which to me is very reminiscent of how Doom 1 level textures slowly became more and more gross and morbid the more you progressed. This is also by far the shortest of all the worlds, containing a whopping 5 whole rims before the boss, which I am more than okay with, for 2 main reasons. By this point, you've done so much backtracking that you're probably exhausted and just want the game to be over. Plus, this area goes above and beyond, and wins the award for having the worst room in the game. Phazon Core, as it's called, will forever live on in infamy in my mind. What makes it so bad? Well, back in the Phazon Mines, when you have to backtrack, the game introduces a new enemy type called the Fission Metroid. I didn't mention it earlier since it's completely avoidable unless you enter the arena for your Mega Pirate again.
What up guys, Editing Ninja here. Turns out they don't actually spawn here in the GameCube version. It's only in Trilogy and later ported over to Remastered, so oops.
Besides, the Phazon Core is where this particular enemy really gets his chance to shine. You see, these Metroids aren't the same as the Metroids I described previously. You can't just ice beam these and call it a day. No. If you try to attack them, they will multiply into different colored Metroids, which you can then kill. That's annoying, no doubt, but still manageable if not time consuming. Well, the game developers saw that and thought, let's have the player have to jump across tiny platforms for 2 whole floors while fighting these. So now you need to fight Metroids that can multiply into 2 on tiny platforms where you can't possibly dodge them. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. You can't even just say screw that and try to rush through them either, since the Metroid is almost guaranteed to grab you during the process, which they can do in mid-air, mind you, and if you fall at any point, you're back at square one. Oh, what the oh my god, why? Really good. I avoided that. What? I fell too? Oh my god. Come on. Stay away. Oh. Stay away. I fell again! Oh my god. This game is freaking bullcrap!
How will Ninja rage? 1. Calm down and play a different game. 2. Ship the game back to Retro Studios. Or 3. Attack the person narrating this segment. Wait a minute.
It feels like they designed this room to be as long as possible to ensure that you will feel pain. The one door that you think might be your savior turns out to be a missile recharge station. I guess that's useful to have right before you fight the final boss, I guess, but to me it felt like a complete insult. Literally one of the few missile recharge stations in the entire game, and it just had to be placed here of all places. Cool. The only other one I could remember while playing was in that stupid hallway I skipped over earlier. It's a sign, I swear.
You can literally picture the room of game developers just panicking that the game isn't quite long enough, so they just scrape together this room last minute, like, oh my god!
Thankfully, there is one strategy I found that makes this room semi-bearable. Power bombs can kill the fission Metroids instantly.
Thank God.
So if you just book it as quickly as you can, while occasionally power bombing the Metroids that attack you, this room actually becomes playable. So thankfully, I did manage to get through this room without losing a single energy tank. And all that's left is an admittedly really cool morph ball path to the boss door. At last, you finally see it for the first time, Metroid Prime.
He said it! Woo! Yeah! Is this joke even funny anymore? I feel like I've only done this a couple times in this video. It's honestly kind of forced. Oh wait, he's getting away!
As big and intimidating as this giant spider thing with sharp teeth might come across, the fight actually starts off fairly basic. The first thing you'll notice is how the boss switches colors to match your beam colors, much like the trooper powers from before. And yeah, you're fighting in much the same way as those, but with a little more projectiles to dodge. Which, now that I think about it, this boss concept comes across as a bit odd to me. Wouldn't this boss make more sense as the boss of the Phazon Mines? That whole area was about fighting the specialized troopers throughout, but I suppose that the elite pirate does fit better, since this fight is honestly really basic. Aside from the boss burrowing down every couple cycles, which is really just a cutscene break more than anything, the boss pattern is literally just attack with the required beam until it takes enough damage, then you morph ball through ridges on the floor to the other side, then rinse and repeat. Really, aside from the sheer amount of health this boss has, this is genuinely easier than the Ridley fight we just did. The ice phase in particular is a complete joke if you picked up the ice spreader, with one successful hit doing enough damage to essentially skip the entire phase. So after destroying this complete Iraq nerd, we drop down to the final floor of the game, where the spider exoskeleton has broken and Metroid Prime's true form finally appears, looking like a mix of the Krazoa spirits from Star Fox Adventures with Black Doom from Shadow Hedgehog. Man, that comparison could not be more spot on than it already is. Joking aside, this is where the fight starts to ramp up, with the boss using the exact same ground attack for the third time in a row, which are easy to dodge but can absolutely destroy your health bar if you aren't careful. Plus the boss is completely impervious to your weapon fire as well. At least it seems that way at first until the game shows you a cutscene of a Phazon pile appearing on the floor. As a player, what are we supposed to do now?
No. Not this time.
The game clearly wants to go towards it, and once you do, you enter what the game calls Hyper Mode, completely overwhelming your entire arm cannon with Phazon, causing the arm cannon to extend in all directions, turning your normal beam fire into a continuous stream of Phazon, the pure strength allowing you to damage Metroid Prime for a short period of time, before eventually running out. Rinse and repeat with this strategy, much like the first phase, with some minor variation as it continues, like how you need to switch between the 3 visors in order to see Metroid Prime, much like the Omega Pirate fight. They also decided to spawn Fission and Hunter Metroids into Phazon spots as a cheap way to add some difficulty, but sadly for them, the Phazon beam rips right through them. Take that, you absolute waste of space! How dare you knock me down in that room? The power bombs are just a
This is very cathartic for me.
This second phase is harder than the first, while still remaining pretty manageable assuming you hunted for the energy tanks. The only thing that struck me as unfair are the Metroid spawns, but as long as you still have a handful of power bombs left, then you should be more than fine. But even then, this end portion really just serves as a bit of a power trip for the player more than anything. But this video has gone on long enough, so let's finish what we started months ago. Upon its defeat, Metroid Prime suddenly begins to implode rapidly, and while she attempts to escape, Samus gets grabbed by one of Prime's tentacles, which then forcefully rips the Phazon suit away. Then Samus runs back to her ship before Prime can explode, making it back just in time. As the ruins of the temple is left burning in the rain, Samus stands on his ship looking on. And if you're a gamer and collected over 75% of the items in this game like me, Samus will remove her helmet, showing her face in its fully 3D glory, before returning to his ship and taking off back into space. Roll credits. This ending won't win any awards or anything, but considering how much has already been wrapped up by this point, I think having a more low-key ending to this game suits it. Once the credits are finished, you are shown your item completion rate and how long it took you to finish the game, just in case you plan on doing a second playthrough, which is a series standard, and the idea is strengthened by hard mode being unlocked as well. Normally I would say that's not something I would do, but I did beat this game 3 times during the course of writing, so I think I'm actually a liar. After the mission final screen, you see the pile of Phazon for the bottom of the impact crater still oozing and making noise, until suddenly... Ooh, a sequel tease! This may seem like kind of a minor reward for the amount of effort you have to put in order to see it, but comparing it to the 100% endings we get for games these days, it's honestly pretty damn hype. I wish Mario Odyssey ending with a sequel tease instead of confetti. Thanks, guys. You might think that the video would end here, but we still have a few more completion awards to discuss. Namely, the Metroid Fusion Connection Awards. A lot of GameCube games around this time were really trying to push the use of the GameCube to Game Boy Advance connection cable for some reason. Usually it was in the form of some primitive minigame or demo you could play independently in the GBA itself, or your Four Swords Adventures, and you're too ambitious, to the point where only a small subset of people would ever be able to afford it, let alone utilize it to its fullest. Metroid Prime is somewhere in the middle, simply just adding another completion award for the player. If you complete Metroid Fusion and connect it, you get the ability to play the original NES Metroid, which I'm sure was probably a cool throwback at the time, and if you happen to buy Prime and Fusion but not the NES Classic Metroid, it was probably a really good bargain. But in my personal opinion, the idea of playing Metroid 1 with the GameCube's tiny imprecise D-pad doesn't sound like the most desirable method of play. So despite the fact that I do in fact have access to a Fusion cartridge, I didn't exactly feel compelled to beat the whole game just to show us off for 5 seconds. Besides, if you complete Prime and connect Fusion, you gain access to the Fusion suit in a subsequent playthrough, which is honestly pretty cool and makes doing the second playthrough in hard mode much more enticing. Although I will say the actual costume itself does look pretty goofy in most scenarios, and in my opinion is a downgrade overall. But it has its fans, and I can't deny the pure novelty factor on display, which obviously makes it a worthwhile unlockable if you happen to own Fusion these days.
And with that, I finally said everything I need to say about Metroid Prime. The video's over. Woo, let's go. I can finally get some sleep.
You should be spending your time playing actually good games.
Wait, I forgot to talk about Remastered.
I mentioned previously that I got back into Prime from the remaster being announced. And although this is a video talking about the original GameCube version, with the remaster being out, I kind of have to mention it. That being said, I'm just going to be giving my quote-unquote review for this version of the game in particular, since if I went over every single notable difference I found while playing it, then it would get pretty redundant. Like, wow guys, they removed the reflection off this very specific shiny object and chose the ruins? I can't believe it! Also, I would prefer if most of you watching this experience this particular version of the game for yourself. If you're this far into the video and have it, I mean come on, it's a Nintendo game for $40 new. It's as accessible as it'll ever be. Either way, but there is no better place to start than with the graphics.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
I thought that the original graphics were pretty impressive for their time, but somehow the developers managed to upgrade the graphics so much that it's not only impressive for the Switch, it honestly rivals some PS4 games in terms of visuals. It looks absolutely gorgeous. Sometimes when I play a game from the 5th generation of consoles and don't return to it for a while, you sort of get this biased recollection of how the game looked, but he somehow managed to make the game look like that mental image, and I could not be happier. You don't realize how limited the lighting in the original game really was until you see it drastically improved. It does come at the cost of your beam weapons lighting up dark hallways, but I think that's well worth the trade-off. All of this also running at an absolutely insane 900p 60 FPS.
That might sound laughable, but for a Switch game, that's basically the equivalent of it running at 4K 120 FPS.
It's also buttery smooth to play thanks to 4 variable control options given to the player. The two most obvious ones are the GameCube and gyro controls, which emulate both the original awkward controls and then the Wii Remote pointer controls from Trilogy, you know if you're into that. But new to the remaster is a dual stick setup. In addition, that makes perfect sense since that has been the industry standard for over 20 years, so not having it would be pretty embarrassing. But honestly, I found using it a little awkward since my monkey brain has become so used to tank controls of the original that using dual sticks just feels absolutely wrong in every way. Plus, needing to hold on a button in order to swap the visor and beam selections just feels less intuitive in general to me. Thankfully though, the developers kept all this in mind with the hybrid control option, which keeps the same tank controls as the original, but with all of the motion control quirks of the other options. And holding R to free aim while standing still has been replaced by a gyro aiming button, which I am a big fan of. Even if you somehow want even more control options, you can enable many more like the ability to free aim while locked on using both gyro and a second stick, and the sensitivity for every joystick axis and gyro based movement. Essentially, any controller option that the series has ever had is present in this game to some extent. Except for the tapping on the screen to shoot trash from first hunt I guess, which is an egregious exclusion. 0 out of 10. Both of those major improvements to Remastered only makes it miles better than the original in my opinion. If you were to pick up Metroid Prime now, then I would 100% recommend the Remastered. There exists some every quality of life improvements, like certain destroyable parts in the environment meant for collectibles will stay destroyed so you know if you've collected it without needing to waste time and items. They also added all of the quality of life improvements from Trilogy, like the spring ball, but that's outside the scope of this video. But there are some changes specific to the remaster that I didn't like, so let's talk about those. The first thing I'll point out are the doors. They literally took out all the depth from them. Game ruined. Alright, I'm memeing, that one doesn't count. But in actuality, the one thing that I genuinely thought was worse was the thermal visor. I'm not sure why, but they added some sort of ghosting effect to it, which makes the act of seeing in the dark even more annoying than it already was. I actively didn't like having the visor equipped at any time, since it really disoriented me when you're being forced to use it. Like the escape sequence in the space pirate base. It ends up becoming more of a miserable slog than it was before. But aside from that, I guess the scan icon for each item feels kind of dull without the Chozo symbol on them, but that's starting to get pretty nitpicky. Remastered is an incredible revamp of the original game that I think fixes every major issue I could think of. It makes it much more accessible to modern players, without losing what made the original game so challenging and fun in the first place. It feels weird to me just how much better this remaster is, since I used to think that Prime 1 really didn't need any upgrades at all, but I guess that's just the beauty of a good remake. But yeah, in conclusion, Prime Remastered is better in every way pretty much, not even exaggerating. Really, the only thing missing from Remastered is the Metroid Fusion Connection Awards. Wait, that means the Fusion suit is missing.
So anyway, I'm boycotting Metroid Prime Remastered. They ruined the whole game.
In conclusion, Metroid Prime is a good game. I know, only the hottest of takes on this channel. But on a serious note, with all that I've covered in this absolutely exhaustive video to make, we need to ask ourselves if Metroid Prime 1 lives up to the insane level of hype that it receives on the internet. And that's a bit of a complicated question, because on one hand, the game had to achieve two different goals in order to be considered a success. The first of which is taking a critically acclaimed franchise that prospered during the 16-bit era and is currently on an 8-year-long hiatus, if we don't count Fusion since at least a literal day before, without succumbing to the same issues that several other franchises had to face years earlier. On the other hand, with this game releasing during an uptick of first-person shooters in the market, you need to find a suitable approach to combine the puzzle-solving focus and non-linear progression of the Metroidvania genre and the constant action and satisfying gameplay loop of first-person shooter combat. Needless to say, that's not exactly a very easy task to do, with both of those having an almost completely opposite appeal from one another. In my opinion, it absolutely succeeded. Looking back at all those rough transitions to 3D from the past, so many of them failed because they were focused on taking what worked during the 16-bit days, then forcing that type of linear gameplay into 3D with no consideration for how well that would function in reality. The reason why a game like Mario 64 worked is because the versatile and fluid movement, combined with the new sandbox approach to level design, made the player want to explore the world around them. It was an entirely new way to tackle the platforming genre, built around the fact that levels can actually be explored to their fullest, adding a much greater sense of scale to the experience. Ironically enough, as much of a meme as it is, Sonic honestly got off much better than people were willing to give him credit for. You actually remember Sonic Adventure, unlike Contra Legacy of War. Yeah, that gem from the PS1 days. I'm going on this slight tangent to say that Metroid had to change in order to work in 3D. And although the puzzle solving that permeates through the entire genre had to be put on a backseat, I think the larger focus on combat more than makes up for that. Sure, Metroid Prime isn't gonna end up being some complete head scratcher to finish like Super Metroid, but it didn't need that in order to remain memorable. Sure, you will still get confused and lost and need to backtrack a fair number of times, and there is still just enough puzzles in place where you don't forget that this is indeed still a Metroid game. But at its core, Prime is a game about the world building itself more so above anything else. Whether it be slowly making a way through the cracked and plant-infested remains of the Chozo ruins, piecing together the story of what befell them, or if you're just interested in blasting some space pirates and saving the world from the Phazon, your time is spent exploring and experiencing the world of Town 4 and its inhabitants above anything else. And I think that is what makes Prime truly stick out for me when compared to the other entries in the franchise. As I progressed through the game, primarily I obviously wanted to figure out what new power-up is next, but at the same time, another part of me was curious about what new locales I would find, what new creatures I would be up against. I wanted to see what new part of Town 4 was heading away just beyond the next elevator. It made me excited to explore, and isn't that really what the point of a Metro game should be? The cherry on top of all this being the responsive and satisfying combat system that rewards experimentation and really highlights how powerful you became over the course of your playthrough. Using the super missile to take out some poor unsuspecting fool really never gets old. So is Metroid Prime really a 10 out of 10 game? Might sound like a bit of a redundant question, but with the release of Prime Remastered, more than a few outlets have given the game a 10, most notably IGN, who had given the original GameCube version a 9.8 back when it first released. This is a question I've been asked a few times during the process of writing this video, and my answers have differed somewhat depending on the day, which can make it a hard question to answer. I could sit here and complain about the sheer amount of backtracking that you need to do in order to complete the game, some of which can definitely be considered unnecessary, or the somewhat outdated control scheme that can make platforming awkward at the worst of times. But considering when this game was released and what goals it's set to achieve, I would say that yes, it deserves the reputation it has earned. For Metroid's first real 3D game ever, I don't think there was any other way it could have been improved. No game is perfect, every 10 out of 10 game has flaws. Breath of the Wild has many issues that have been reported far and wide, from the frame rate dips, the voice acting, to the story, but I would not hesitate for even a second to give that game a 10. So I think I can excuse the issues I had with this game, because no matter the day, I can boot up some Prime 1 and have a blast playing it. So if you have stuck with me throughout this whole video and somehow haven't played this game by this point, then I think you are doing yourself a massive disservice. If you feel like Metroid games are too intimidating or confusing, please give Metroid Prime an honest chance.
And with that, I've finally said everything I've ever needed to about Metroid Prime 1 in my entire lifetime, so I'm glad I finally got that off my chest. Which raises another question. Will I cover Metroid Prime 2? Will Nintendo remaster Prime 2? I would certainly hope they would. I like Prime 2 a lot. And as far as covering it goes, I'm not entirely sure at this current moment. This video has been kind of a huge project, a lot bigger than I anticipated it to be, but that's how it is, I guess. But if you want me to do it again, just let me know you liked the video. Haha, wink wink. Wait a minute, who is that?
I am Harrison, your evil clone.
It's the obligatory cliffhanger for a sequel video. No!
Come on.
What?
Oh.
Let's go.
No.
Let's go.
I'll buy a choice. I'm a shill. I'm a shill. I'll buy a choice.